I'm a 17-year-old guy currently living in Phoenix, Arizona. This incident took place around 6 months ago on an overnight trip into Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail because I've been doing this stuff long enough to realise what happens when you post things like that. Whether it's a good trail, abandoned mine, ghost or whatever. But hey, to my story. On this particular trail, I was taking an 8-mile loop through a canyon. Pretty simple in and out overnight trip. I had planned to go out with my friend, but a last minute cancel on his part left me on my own, so I packed the bags and car and decided to head over there. Not leaving the house on time, and so having trouble navigating the forest roads. I didn't arrive to the trailhead until around 5:45, which for those of you who don't backpack, this is a big no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it's getting dark quick, so I figured if I moved quick enough, I could get at least 2 or 3 miles out of the trip and find a spot. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail on my own, about 15 miles upon dirt road, and there's nothing between me and anybody else here. Hiking in the dark alone is scary, especially for the fact that I'm alone. Eventually it gets dark and I can only see where my headlamp was pointing, and that's when I figured I needed to stop and get a camp set up. With only my headlights as my main source of light, it's a struggle. I ended up in a less than ideal spot, but there were some burnt pieces of wood at the side and the remains of a fire circle, like a lot of people have been there before, but definitely not recently. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me trying to find some dry wood and get a fire going. I got my tarp set up and cracked open a can of chili mac that I brought with me, and I was really looking forward to eating it. I'm feeling good. My camp was set up and the fire was going. The feeling of uneasiness from the hike had almost gone, but it was still a little bit there. To understand fully what happened, I have to explain to you how my camp is set up. The site I had picked was a small clearing surrounded by large pine trees with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods and have a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it and everything on the edge of the circle is pitch black. I was sitting on the ground near my fire eating dinner when a small rock about the size of a marble is thrown into my camp. Now, I'm pretty scared at this point because I'm positive that I'm the only person on this trail overnight. I immediately turned my light on, and towards the area where I'd seen the rock thrown, I see something moving, just about 10 feet away. I spent the next 15 minutes in disbelief, as I'm sure something's there in the tree line. I'm not daring to go far from the fire. I was able to convince myself that I had somehow kicked the rock over or it had fallen from a tree. I decided to go to sleep that night, not expecting pure terror, and that's what happened. I woke up to the sound of rustling leaves, barely audible if you were listening for them, but they're still there. Still in a sleepy daze, I listened as the rustling of leaves got even harder as I assumed they were moving away from me. I went to grab my handheld flashlight that I had left next to me when I'd fallen asleep, but the more I look, the more scared I get as I come to realise that it's not there. I sit up in my sleeping bag and duck out of my tarp and look around. I was able to see a light off in the woods. It couldn't have been there much further than 15 feet away. It's my flashlight, laying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This is one of the few moments in my life where I've nearly soiled myself. The flashlight that I had left sitting right next to me when I'd fallen asleep a few hours ago is now 15 feet away from me past the tree line in the woods. I hurriedly slipped my boots on, clutching my knife in my other hand and keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed the options: staying here and wait out the night, or attempt a 3-mile hike all the way back to the car in the dark. I figured whatever or whoever was out there for me was definitely going to have the advantage if I don't have a light. I decide I have to stay there. Eventually, it came back. I can hear this thing walking through the woods. It was far off, but I know it's there. It sounded like somebody leisurely walking around, like they're strolling without a care in the world. Sometimes it would walk too far away and I would lose it for a bit, but then, an hour or two later it would return, ever so faint. This went on for about 3 or 4 hours until I listened to the steps getting closer and closer until they were about 7 feet from me. At this point the fire had gotten very small and I'd run out of wood in my pile. The footsteps stopped and everything went silent. I sat there still for 2 hours clutching the knife, praying that I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that until the sun started to come up, and I could see that I was alone in my campsite. I packed my things and speed walked down the tree line, 3 miles back down the trails I'd taken. I arrive at the empty dirt road where my car is and nearly sprinted to it as I unlocked it. I jumped in and drove and didn't stop until I put at least 20 miles between me and that place. I stopped in a gas station in Apocaly Junction to buy a Red Bull, but mostly just to see or talk to somebody. As I exited the store, I was able to read what was written in the dust of the back part of my window. Sleep well? ? Now, a lot of weird things have happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this is by far the weirdest and scariest I've ever experienced in my life. So I grew up in a very remote home located deep in the woods. Like, I was homeschooled because there was no people for literally miles, not much less a school, but it was great. My dad always took me out hunting and exploring in the woods. My mother had a garden that she grew lots of foods in. Well, the foods would always attract animals, especially rabbits. The thing was, every time a rabbit even appeared in our yard, the next day it would be dead. They always had their necks snapped up and legs broken or something nasty, and placed along the garden wall. I grew up with this, but one day when I was 11 or 12 I asked my parents about it. They told me that the week they moved into the house they'd gotten one of those rabbits on the porch and it just kept going. My mum thought it was some animal, but what animal would break another one's legs and leave it out? It's like what they do in the Amazon tribes when they get a frog. My dad figured that they had a neighbour that we didn't know about, but there's no houses nearby. So, were they living in the woods somewhere? He left a note on the porch asking for them to not leave the rabbits on the porch, so next time they appeared in the garden, well, I guess we just got used to it, and would sometimes leave snacks on the porch which they would take. But one day my dad decided to buy a camera to see who was killing the rabbits. He left some snacks on the porch and pointed the camera towards it and gone to sleep. When he woke up, the snacks were gone and quickly checked the camera, and what he sees terrifies him to this day. You could see a figure dressed in black run across the yard, crouch on the porch, shove the snacks into their mouth, then run off, all in under 3 minutes. The next day my dad found the camera broke on the porch with a dead rabbit. Apparently they don't want to be filmed. That was 11 years ago, and to this day my parents still get rabbits and snacks that are taken by this weird figure. About 4 years ago, me and some of my friends were driving down a rural road in Maine wilderness. I was driving pretty slow and we're talking about college. All of a sudden, out of the woods on the left side, a woman walked out in front of the car. She's our age, so early 20s, maybe 5'3" with blonde hair. She was wearing a flannel shirt over a white shirt and jeans. There was some blood on her jeans and hands. Not a lot, but enough to notice. She stopped on the right side of the road and just stares at us. My friend rolled down his window and says, "Do you need help?" She said she could use a ride to a nearby gas station and we agreed to drive her there. She got into the back with my friend and I and go on our way. She was quiet until my friend asked if she was hurt because of the blood. She said no, she'd been hunting something big. And we'd assumed she meant deer, but that's because my friend had hunted deers too. She said that it's cool, but not that she'd been hunting anything really like you'd expect. We arrived at the next gas station and she got out and went in. We waited for her to come out, but she didn't, so we left. Now we wonder what exactly she was hunting out there. And I should add too, this is at about 10 o'clock at night. Back around 2004 or 5, I was leaving a buddy's house to head home. He lived in Lake Ariel in Wayne County. I was a good 15 miles away, so I decided to take back roads to save time and avoid the police. As I crest the mountain road, I see a van off the side, doors open, lights on. It's well after midnight, and nobody's on the road. I slow my car, an 89 VW ragtop, down to first gear looking for a person or persons that may be hurt. Not a soul is around and the woods are quiet. The van off the road is not running, but all the lights are on, and the driver's side door is on. I remembered thinking this is a little weird, and I don't actually have any service on my phone to call the police because we're up the mountain. So I proceeded to go towards where I knew I had cell service, maybe going 30 miles per hour tops. I knew the situation was bad, but then it gets worse. No more than 3 or so miles away, the brush thinned out on the roadside, so you had a better view of what's in the woods. And I see movement. I let off the gas, thinking that I don't want to go straight past the deer into another one. As I let off, a man soaking in fresh blood comes out from the tree line into the road. He's so covered that I can't really tell what it is at first. He stumbled out in front of the car and waves me down. I'm starting to panic a lot now. He starts grabbing and yelling at my door. I've got really scared and took off. Another mile or so I had cell service and called the cops. He was obviously hurt and his grab for my door scared me. There was a wide space on the mountain where I agreed to wait for the cops, and they're there in about 10 minutes. While I waited there, I put the top on the car and locked the doors. An officer took my statement and looked at my car with a torch. The guy from the woods left some blood on the door. Another one found the van but can't find the guy. The cops let me go home and they say they'll let me know if anything happened. Within a few days I get a call saying that the van was located where they thought and asked if I could describe the man. They never found him that night. As far as I know, they never did. Apparently the van was stolen and this guy bandaged himself up and took off afterwards, never to be seen again. My family owns a lot of land, and on this land we often have problems with squatters. My dad and one of my friends and I would all go out to check out places where apparently people were staying that shouldn't be. I mean, we had more than enough private property signs, and they're just annoying, especially if they're potentially doing lawless activities on our property. So one night, we have such an event. Someone's been sleeping in one of our cabins. Yes, it's derelict, but it's ours, and apparently they look like they're crackheads. Ah, great. Not only have we got to clear it up, but we're also going to have to take out some drugs so nobody or any of our animals can get hurt on them. Unfortunately for us, we have to check it out quick because my mum's getting really worried and nightfall's about to set, which only makes it worse for us. We walk up there and we're just having a laugh saying, I hope they're not armed, because I know that we are. All of us have rifles on us, and my dad has a shotgun. If it comes to it, heck, we're gonna light them up. I'm not gonna take any risks, and the law's not gonna be on their side if they're already breaking the law but also trespassing on our property. We get in there, and it's quiet. Just too quiet. My dad said he's gonna go outside for a cigarette. I decide to join him. We're really confused because we had seen them a couple of nights ago. They must still be around here. Eventually all of us are outside. I turn my back on the cabin for 1 second and I hear a loud pitched scream. It makes me drop my cigarette. I look around and can't find the source of the sound. We all have our hands on our weapons. We now see a faint glow behind us. I suddenly have this warm feeling. I'm not one to believe in the paranormal, but it's strange. I turn round and to my horror, the entire cabin's been set on fire. I mean, not like a normal natural fire you could start with even a match, like the whole thing had been doused in gasoline. Like somebody was waiting for us to stay in there, heard the door close, and then tried to burn us alive. We never actually found out who did this, but my god, would we have let them have it if we found them. We called the police, but unfortunately, as the cabin had burnt down, there was no evidence in there, and the case remains unsolved to this day. This is my mum's story that happened when she's about 18 years old. Back then she lived in a small town in Germany, and she would go on bike tours frequently. This particular day, she wanted to ride the bike to the forest, have a picnic there and ride back home. She had done that a bunch of times and said it wasn't an unsafe place to be, and she would always set up her stuff near the road, just in case. Anyway, when she almost got to the spot she usually goes, there's a boy fixing his bike. My mum said he's maybe 14. My mum wasn't on the bike anymore. She was wheeling it, because she was almost there. When passing the guy, he jumps her, and the next thing she knows, she's face down on the ground. She instantly starts yelling at him to get off and what are you doing? He instantly gets up. But my mum takes the opportunity to get the hell out of there. My mum didn't call the cops or anything because, well, nothing happened. This isn't all though. Fast forward 4 or 5 years on, a few towns over, this guy's on the news. For murder. He would wait for women in the park, pounce on them and kill them. My mum was just glad that this happened when she was younger, because if he was older he might have been stronger and managed to get her dead in the forest. I like primitive camping, and me and my wife go out sometimes by ourselves. We usually bring the dog and spend a couple of nights. This time we invited some friends for drinking. Anyway, on the first day, we heard a vehicle coming down the road. Not odd. There are maybe 10 sites or more several miles down the road. It's a dirt road, with nothing there but these primitive sites. One way in and one way out. What's odd though, is that the vehicle that they see is a meat packing truck. It was old, really old, and the lettering was faded. It was faded in beige. None of us really made out the person driving it. There were no plates on the back either. So we all get creeped out collectively. We kind of decide it's not too weird. Maybe they're just renting it out for the cheap. Flash forward to the morning. My mum calls. She's panicking. freaking out. Apparently, some hikers were literally abducted within a few miles of us. There are several girls out at our site too, and my mum's convinced it was the people we saw. I wasn't 100% certain, so pull out my GPS. It was less than half a mile from where we were. I don't remember much of what happened after, but we got the hell out of there. When I was a kid, I grew up at a campground. I'd literally spend the whole summer there, as a relative managed it and worked night security, so I'd been camping throughout my life. On my 21st birthday, some buddies and I decided to go on a trip and do some real camping away in the bush. We Google Maps'd a nice spot near a river along the coast of Lake Superior, out of our way. It was only a few hours to boat there, and we would canoe along the beach for a few miles to get to this spot. We're talking real remote. The nearest road was 5 miles away, and other than trekking through the woods, the only way to get there would be to go back the way we come from, along the beach. So we set up camp near dark, got a nice fire going, and just drank for a few hours. So around midnight, we're all getting tired. After all the paddling and stuff, we were pretty ready to get our tents out. Now, even though I've been camping my whole life, I'm still a light sleeper. I can hear something moving around outside the tents normally. Now right now, I hear heavy footsteps. They're clearly from shoes. I assume it's not an animal, I mean obviously, but it's just one of my friends going to use the bathroom. Even though I don't hear any zipper sounds to the tent, the steps begin to slowly fade away towards the beach. After about 20 minutes or so, I forget about them and begin to drift off to sleep. The next morning, we all get up and start making breakfast and collecting wood. The walking never comes up and we carry on. Now later in the day, we all head to the river to do some fishing and split off into groups. I'm fishing with the friend in the tent next to mine when the other guys split off. He starts saying if I heard anything last night. I tell him about the footsteps and he nods. He then tells me that about an hour after they walked off, they came back. I mention to him that it's probably someone from camp, and he tells me that he doesn't think so because they never went to the tent. He says that the steps walked past the tent, then carried on into the woods. Now jump forward to the last day of the trip. No steps are heard, all throughout the week. Until last night. We're all settled in nice and early, and we have to pack up our stuff and paddle back. And about half an hour in, I can hear steps off at the back edge of the clearing again. They're kind of faint, but as I can start to hear them more clearly, they picked up the pace until they're at full run. And they storm past all the tents into the beach again. We're talking full sprint like you're running for your life, and it's loud as hell. This time, everyone wakes up and climbs out of their tents, flashlights and everything. We all jump out, but there's literally no signs whatsoever that anybody ran here. The soil in the area is fairly soft. If it was a deer or bear, there's going to be clear footprints, but a human? That would definitely leave some. Not even the grass was disturbed. I've never seen anything like it. Being in such a remote area, I really think it must have been something paranormal. Nobody got any sleep after that. We all pack up our stuff except the chairs, and wait around the fire until the sun comes up, paranoid and ready. One of my buddies suggested it could be a Wendigo, but I don't know. scared the life out of me. My family owned lots of swampland, and we had small cabins set up on some of these, because it could be really nice as a getaway sometimes. There's something about being out in nature which is just so relaxing and nice. All of that changed one day, however. When I was about 14, me and my best friend stayed in the cabin. We mostly played video games and just had a good laugh. One night there was a really big thunderstorm, and we had to retreat from the cabin to get back inside. Now the next morning, my friend looked out the window and said, "Oh, I thought we were staying in the closest one to us." I said, "What are you talking about? We were." He said, "No, we couldn't have been." I looked out the window, and to my amazement, the cabin was no longer there. I then rushed downstairs to tell my dad, wondering what on earth has happened, and my mum meets me halfway up the stairs saying, "You're not going to believe what's happened. The ground that was underneath the cabin you two boys were staying in has collapsed, and the cabin's gone." To this day, it's one thing that's horrified me more than anything. The fact that we were so close to danger and didn't even know it. Heck, nobody knew it. These events took place in the spring of 2014. My friend Samantha and Tanny had finally agreed to come camping with me. The problem is that none of us were experienced in surviving the wilderness, but that didn't stop us. We packed up our gear, loaded up on food, alcohol, and made our way to our location. When we arrived at the spot, Sarah had Googled. We realised that we would have to hike for a while in order to find a spot suitable for camping. We hiked for some time before reaching a clearing. We set up camp and started a fire, opening a bottle of tequila. After some drinking and smoking a bit, I decided to start preparing dinner, so I left Samantha and Tanny by the fire as I was separating our dinner. As I was busy separating, I realised a man's approaching our camp. "Hey there," he said with a thick Irish accent. I was caught off guard as I wasn't expecting to see anyone, but nonetheless, he seems friendly, so I reply, "Oh, hey, I didn't even notice you. Been hiking for a while?" "Yeah, for a bit." "What are you cooking there?" He gestures to me. I invited him to join us because I'm not rude, and he seems nice. So we walk over to the fire where I introduce him to the others, who seem extremely unimpressed about our new guest. After eating dinner, we kept drinking, but during this time, it was becoming very clear that our guest had really taken a liking to me. He kept trying to move closer to me and was paying little to no attention to my friends. He was only speaking and focusing on me, while drinking his bottle of whiskey. That's when things took a turn and his conversations become weird, making everyone uncomfortable. But it wasn't until he leant over, grabbed the back of my neck and said, "Come on, babe, get rid of these two idiots and come into the woods with me," before I could even react. And then, Tanny was already right behind him, trying her best to get him away from me, while screaming like a banshee. I can't remember what she was saying, but she was inventing her own words. It worked. He let go of my neck, took a step back, looked at Tanny, and let out the most sinister smile that I've ever seen. It was something that I can't describe. For that, he had beautiful teeth and a smile, but something about the combination of his eyes just filled me with goosebumps. Even typing this, I'm having the same reaction. He He slowly starts walking away from my camp while laughing. I'm absolutely petrified, but decided to quickly tidy up before heading to my tent and hide. I was originally meant to sleep in my own tent while the other two shared, but we all went to the same one. Everything had been quiet for a while, with the exception of Tiny snoring. I was about to fall asleep when I hear twigs crunching and the sounds of footsteps fast approaching us. I lay still, holding my breath, completely immobilized by fear, until I heard my tent being opened, and Samantha let out a scream so loud that it even jolted the Irish psycho, and he jumps back a few steps. Tanny has been woken by this stage, and we're all standing outside the tent. Samantha and Tanny yelling, and I'm fumbling with my phone trying desperately to call the police. He then hits Tanny in the face. I drop everything. I yell, "Run, just run." I held Tanny's arm and don't look back. Importantly, we only have socks on, and we're running through the woods at night, with a psycho chasing us. I ran until I trip over a log, smash my chin down on the ground pretty hard. That's where all three of us stay hidden, low to the ground for a few hours, but it's pitch black. When we felt safe enough, we walk back to the campground and find everything destroyed. Both Samantha and Tanny had everything stolen of value. Weirdly though, my phone is smashed, not even stolen, making me realise how bad his intentions were. I thank my lucky stars I had no documents that could identify me. The last thing I wanted was him knowing where I lived. We don't waste any more time and ran back to our car as fast as possible, occasionally injuring ourselves on the way as we can barely see anything. We get to the car and I'm trying to start the engine, which is doing that sound it makes when it's about to die. When he sees us, he suddenly starts running out of the bushes towards us, laughing. We all scream hysterically and I floor it. God, I'm so scared. I drove like an absolute maniac until we reached the next town over, only to discover that my car's been tampered with and is leaking oil. God, it was done by that psycho. We eventually get picked up by Tanny's dad, taking us to the police station immediately. And unfortunately she broke her jaw in 2 places, and they never found him. I hate the fact that he's not been caught. For all I know, he could still be out there lurking on people, just like he did with us. I know that situation could have ended so much worse. Like I said before, the part I hate in all of this is that he smashed my phone, making sure there was no trace of him or his location. He wasn't even willing to steal the phone because he knew the police could probably track it. God, it makes me sick thinking about this. I was at the office later than normal, but not excessively late. I left at about 6 and realised I needed gas, so I stopped at the 1-2 minutes from my job. It was still light out because of the summer, which made the situation weirder. I go to the gas station, and nothing has happened there before, so I was pretty relaxed, and just tired in general from work. Now while I'm pumping gas, I see a truck pull in, which is kind of rusty, with 2 guys in the front, but perpendicular in the way it's parked, which is weird, but I just keep filling my car so I can head home. The 2 guys just look like 2 guys from the country, a bit older, like 40s or 50s, but I felt uncomfortable. The guy driving was talking softly, but I ignored him at first, I didn't realise he was even trying to speak to me. The guy then yelled at me, which catches me off guard. I think I said something along the lines of, "Can I help you?" The driver was motioning for me to come closer to talk, which I didn't because it feels off. The guy finally spoke at a normal level and said they're looking for the shortest covered bridge. The country I'm in is known for this. This wasn't too weird of a question, but it's a little hard to point out without a map. I briefly told the guys the directions from the gas station and was grabbing the receipt. This is when all of the red flags go off in my head. He, the driver, asked me to lead them there now. It was out of the way and I say hell no and get in my car. He then starts screaming at me to get in their truck. Now this really scares me. He then starts to get out of his truck. I haven't got time for this. I floor it. The truck doesn't move, so I have to back out. I was worried about them following me, and they did follow my car, but I quickly take a few random turns and manage to lose them on the highway. Oh, the whole time the passenger was staring at me too. The whole thing was weird to me, but what scared me was that they were trying to get me out in the middle of nowhere to do God knows what to me. I'm just glad I got out of there when I did. I was a little young when this happened, so I don't really remember it. So this is the story my mum has told me. When I was around 5 or 6, my family and a family of friends all went camping together in New Hampshire. Each family had a camper and we all set up at one campsite. The campground had a playground, a lake nearby, and there was always something going on. One day, me and my friend Keisha, who was around the same age as me, were playing on our campsite as our mums talked outside the camper, keeping their eyes on us. At some point, an old man came walking by our campsite. He seemed like a normal guy according to my mum, but then he started to walk up and start a conversation with our parents. He said he owns a campsite a little way down the path, and that he has his own little playground in the backyard of his camper. He then said to me that my friends are allowed to come over any time that we wanted to play. My friend's mum was oblivious to the situation though, telling him it's a very nice gesture and we can later possibly. My mum on the other hand, who's to say the very least has experience with creeps, shut him down, told him no, go away. He walked away and my friend's mum started asking my mum why it's such a big deal. My mum told her that there's already a playground at the campsite and that we do not go under any circumstances. She even went around to the other campsites to warn people and stay away. Weeks pass, the camping trip is over and everyone's home for the rest of the summer. My mum is doing things around the house when she gets a phone call from her friend from the camping trip. She's freaking out, apologizing, telling her that she'll never go against her judgments again. Turns out, she turned the news on, and there he is. Apparently he got into a local pharmacy trying to get pictures developed and he had hundreds of pictures of children. So this actually happened today. I live in a pretty nice neighborhood, and compared to the rest of my city, my area is considered safe. Well, I thought that was true until now. Me and my 2 foster sisters were walking home from school on the route we take every day, and we reached the intersection that we cross to get to our street. It's a very long wait until we're able to cross, and we usually just jaywalk. So me and one of my friends made it across, but My one friend got stuck in the middle with this girl who looks about the same age as us. And she just got off school, not saying anything. She's not saying anything, just kept walking. Now 2 or 3 minutes later, she's coming running behind me. And by then, we're at our house, and she tells us to get inside fast, but it takes forever for someone to open the door, and I'm asking her over and over again what's happening. And she just says, I think I was almost human trafficked, and at some point, the girl who was calmly walking down the street started behind us like nothing happened. When we finally got inside, she told me the girl started talking to her, and at first, my friend just thought she was being friendly when she asked what school she went to, but then the red flags began. She asked her who my other friend and I were, and where she was going, and where she lived at and what her name was, and then she heard a car rev up their engine. She turned around to see a white van parked in a small parking lot across the street with 3 men in it, and the girl also looked and started speaking faster, asking her if she wanted to walk home with her, and it's only down one street. Finally, the light said walk and she took off. But that girl now knows where we live. But thankfully, my friend saw the red flags and didn't give away any information, or didn't agree to walk with her. And I know it may sound like maybe this girl was also scared, but when she walked past our house, she looked completely fine, like nothing happened. Like she was just a girl walking home from school. She didn't look at all unusual. We have yet to tell our parents what happened. I just pray I don't see that freaking van. When I was younger, my friends and my brothers would always go camping together. We weren't too old, and we didn't live too far from a big field and lake. It made great camping though, because it was away from things but not too far away from home. We had one incident, however, that is truly unbelievable, and it made us all never go camping again thereafter. So one night, we're all having a great time doing some fishing in the lake. We have our fire going, and we're just talking about random stuff when suddenly we hear a clicking sound from across the water. Now I can't pin down exactly what it was, but there was something very off about the sound. You could tell an animal wasn't making it, but we're literally the only people there. Anyway, we continue our fishing, and nights fell. What's stranger though, is the clickings persisted for well over an hour now, and that doesn't make any sense. My buddies are starting to get quite paranoid now because it seems to be getting louder. It's almost like no matter where you go, the clicking seems to follow you. I decide to investigate, and so does my brother, and we both stand up simultaneously. As we get up, we can see a figure across from us on the island in the lake. He looks freaking massive though, like at least 7 feet tall. It's so ridiculous, I don't even think it's a real person. We laugh about it saying, oh yeah, the tree scared us. But then the clicking starts even louder. We can now see there's a small fire on the island too. That come out of nowhere. Nobody saw it before. That makes no sense. And then it goes out suddenly. We both scream and look at the rest of the camp, who are also gathered on the shoreline looking at what this thing is. And then, almost on cue, the second we stop screaming, it starts again for 4 seconds, then goes out again. And this illuminates a figure slightly. You can't see it well because whatever it is wearing a robe, but it's an actual thing there. The fire goes out again. We all scream and run away from there. I was so scared and worried that my mum or dad would go out to investigate with the other parents and get hurt that I didn't even tell them. Nobody did. Even 15 years on, it still haunts the life out of me to this day. The thing is, we know nobody was on the island because we could see it was clear during the daytime and we never heard a boat go in there. It's literally the worst experience of my life. I even have goosebumps now thinking of it. When I first returned from the war, I was a power line rigger. This was on EHV lines, which are extra high voltage, the kind on top of the steel towers. Those are transitional lines, not sub-transitional like most inner city lines. So anyway, I had a job during a heavy windstorm in 2008 to go out and repair some lines near Colorado and the New Mexico border. It was great pay, since it was an emergency call out, so I agree. I met up with my crewman and head down from the Colorado Springs area. We get there at around 9 PM and start getting to work. Windstorms are notorious for failing lines, but not EHV or UHV lines, since they are rigged differently. When I crane up to see the broken link on the tower and inspect the damage, I remembered seeing over the tops of most trees. I observed the view for a moment and saw some nearby lights from a campfire. As soon as I saw the lights, I hear yelling coming from that area. Now it must have been about 300 yards away, but I hear a woman yelling. She kept saying, "Someone please help," over and over again. I crane down and start yelling for the guys. They heard it too, and were asking questions. This is really odd. We never see anyone out there. I told them about the campfire lights coming from the direction our trucks were facing. We jump in one of the smaller trucks, since it's a 4x4, and head down the road. We look everywhere for the light, but don't see a thing. We drove back and forth, and then back again and slowed down. We rolled down the windows and stopped the truck in the area where the light should be. We all heard moaning sounds coming from the right of our trucks, so to the north. It sounded like two people are having heart attacks, and I mean really loud. So now we're on edge. The site supervisor was calling the police now. Given the general area we're at, they told us to check to see if we feel safe. Because I have the war veteran attitude, I decided to look. Two guys came down with me, and our supervisor stayed with the truck to wait for police. Apparently, they had a station not too far, like 15 minutes or so away. I armed myself with a pickaxe, and the other guys had conduit pipes like 1 inches. We all started walking through the trees with our headlamps on, because it got really dark now. The moaning's still coming from ahead of us. We got through the trees into a small clearing. It looks empty. The moaning stopped. We checked around and hear nothing. We went back to the truck, and as soon as we got there, we heard the woman yelling again, yelling the same thing. "Someone please help." It was just to the north of where we were. One of the guys yelled back saying, "Where are you?" and gets no reply. Then we hear her scream in pain, and nothing else. We're already running back north and called the police, but they've showed up. They must have seen us running north because 2 of them came after us. We stopped in the field area and they stopped with us and asked what was going on. We told them. They helped us look around and saw nothing. We walked back to the truck and didn't hear anything else. They said they would hang out for us and check if anything else happened so we get working again. The police are now parked next to each other, talking while we worked. When I craned up, I can't see any campfire lights or anything. We did the job. Took about an hour and a half until we're done. When we were packing our tools to head out, one of the cops left, and the other comes with us. He told us that, just to the west, there was a small plane that crashed, and people burned to death. He said the police and paramedics got to the scene, and the fire's still going. He told us about how 2 bodies were found away from the plane, crawling away from it, and one of the bodies is still there somewhere buried from the 70s or 80s. Yeah, we packed up fast and got the hell out of there. Now, I never saw a fire, just light on the trees. Now, I can't tell you how creepy that stuff is to find out afterwards, and the voices and moans were so clear. I always kind of believed in the afterlife after this, but God, did it mess my head up. I'm so glad other people were there to experience it though. The cop believed us too. But I didn't hear anything about reports of a fire or anything else in the area afterwards. Back when I was a Boy Scout, I took a weekend-long training course called National Youth Leadership Training. One of the last parts of the course was an overnight hike into the woods, with no guide, to find our designated campsite and see how we would work under stress. We finally got to our campsite and began to unpack. We each bought a tent, but half of us left ours behind to lighten the load and buddied up. Lo and behold, my buddy brought a one-man tent only. Either I slept outside or things are going to be really cramped and I didn't want that. The sky was clear and I slept under the stars. The next morning, 4 of the other guys claimed that they saw a coyote walk up to me, sniff my face, stare at me, and leave. They were too scared to go and make it leave. They stuck to their guns though, but I didn't believe them. 4 years later, I was working at the camp as a staff member, and I'm speaking to a senior there, and apparently he said coyotes are pretty common there, and they often boldly show up. It made me realise what the guys were saying wasn't a lie. I just can't believe they let me sleep with a coyote literally at my face. God knows what would have happened if I'd woken up. I went camping with some friends near Lochmond in Scotland. We set up camp about 3 miles into the woods near a small river and got the fire going to cook some food we brought with us. The site is very remote, but in the evening a couple of guys hiked through and stopped to chat with us. They're from Poland and seem friendly enough, but ask a lot of questions about our group, how many we were, etc. And I'm a bit suspicious, but I put it down to being from different cultures. It's around 10 PM. I start to feel very ill, and I'm thinking, is it possibly from food poisoning? Now, I'm very confused about this because I'm sure the food was cooked correctly. My friends are all pretty drunk, and I had drunk about 4 or 5 cans of Budweiser. Stupidly, I packed my bag after throwing up hard for 15 minutes and decided to hike back to the main road, watching light fading in the distance. I'm about a mile into the hike back. At this point, I've been sick twice and am completely sobered up by throwing up so much. I've got sports bottles full of water. I now stop to rinse my mouth out. At this point, it's near pitch black, so I got into my bag to get out my torch, small knife and my .22 air gun. As I start zipping my bag back up, I hear twig snap nearby and assume it's a rabbit or fox. I shine my torch, but there's nothing. This doesn't make sense because surely I'm at least going to see reflective eyes, but oh well. 5 minutes later, I hear what sounds like running, maybe 100 yards behind me, and lots of twigs snapping. I turn around and assume it's my friend, and I say, "Are you kidding me?" I said I knew someone's there, and I'm not joking. I see movement through the trees probably 80 feet away. Whatever this is big. I mean 6 or 7 feet tall and completely black. At this point, my sickness is gone, and my heart's beating through my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I get this feeling that I can only describe as feeling almost dizzy at the surreal position that I found myself in. I take off my rucksack and hang it up. I kill my torch. I still think it's my friends, but I have this horrible feeling. It was too big. I've got my knife though in my jacket pocket, and my pistol gripped harder than I can possibly ever do normally. I walk in the darkness for about 100 yards and stop dead behind a tree and wait. I'm trying my hardest to control my breathing, but it's supremely difficult now. Sure enough, I hear movement again. Very difficult to pinpoint, but it's getting closer. Now I'm caught in two minds, to continue to hide or confront. I decide the latter, and now I burst out from the brush. I'm in two minds, but I have to run now. I point my torch in the general direction of the sound, and there's branches moving. I start moving away from the area like an SAS trooper. I hear distance movement again. Lots of twigs breaking now, from heavy footprints. I don't see anyone now, but I know I'll shoot them. Silence now. I wait a few minutes and head back for my backpack. It's not hanging over the branch anymore. It's on the ground. That's the scariest part for me. Whatever I've been chasing could have never beaten me back to my bag. So something or someone else moved it. The branch is intact, which doesn't make sense either. At this point, I tabble out onto the main road pretty sharp with no incident. I call my fiance, who quickly picks me up, and I'm violently sick. I believe it's from fear. I tell her about what happened and she's freaking out. To this day, I still don't know exactly what happened. I do know I was terrified and I've never experienced anything like it before or since. I've had a truly weird encounter before. I lived in Southern California at the time, up in the San Gabriel Mountains, a couple of hours east of LA. I know when people think of Cali, they all seem to think of the beaches, but I assure you, the land here is very diverse. My hometown is super tiny and has a fairly popular ski resort on the western side of town. If you take the only highway out past the ski resort for several miles, there's literally nothing but forest. And a very old gold mine is actually still there, and it's kind of cool. After those things, there's nothing but national forest. And then, one insanely isolated, very old restaurant that still functions, and then back to the forest for a long time. Anyway, just setting the scene. I was about 10 or 11 when this happened. It's almost Christmas. It snowed heavily, and the snow's still falling on the evening of this happening. My stepdad decided that we would cut down our own Christmas tree this year, so we get into my mum's big Dodge truck and headed off to the mine, which is a couple of miles past the ski resort. We got to the base of the road, and were talking and laughing, etc. My stepdad was driving pretty slow since it was snowing decently. They had ploughed part of this road recently too, and there were big snow berms on either side of us, down near up to the top of the truck, probably 8 feet off the ground. So it's just barely getting dark now. Not quite dark, but twilight I guess. So not dark enough that we can't see anything, but dark enough that the headlights of the truck are on. Quite suddenly, from over on my side there comes a huge dark shape that arches over the top of the snow berm. It lands in the middle of the road fairly gracefully almost. My stepdad slams on the brakes. I am too stunned to speak or even scream, because there crouching in the middle of the road is some creature. It has a long muzzle and pointy ears, covered in fur. Now, I have really never seen anything like it. This all happens in seconds. The thing jumps down and crouches, glancing at us. My stepdad slams on the brakes, and then it just vaulted up and over the beam and disappeared. It must have been 6 or 7 feet tall. I have never seen anything quite like it. My stepdad refused to talk about it when I asked, terrified. If he had seen the same thing too, I knew he did because how quick he braked, and that he was wide-eyed and white for the rest of the journey. I never did bring it up again because we hadn't had the best relationship since then, but sometimes I wish I could know what actually happened then. It still shakes me to my very core, even to this day. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and tons of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. Or there are some of out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places. A lot of the people from where I am are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I do a lot of work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of them small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there for too long. No opportunities or chances for the people that fairly deserve it. And nothing for miles around, like honestly, you're trapped there. I hated it. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service for miles or houses. In the past, there's been a lot of vehicle break-ins on the trailheads. I mean literally, the gravel there is littered with bits of broken glass from what I can only assume is break-ins. Sometimes there's really shifty people hanging around those trailheads or just driving around out on the forest roads. There are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat up $500 cars barreling along them that are meant for a 4x4. Some of the people you see in the cars look like the guy that got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that said, it's still a great place to camp. However, you have to be careful. A few years ago, 2 friends of mine and I decided to play paintball in the national forest. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip, so we can play the next morning also. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drive a couple of miles to one of the most popular camping spots. Sadly, A church group or something had taken up all the spots. This really got us annoyed. This was really the only camping spot that we're familiar with, and it's getting late. We decide to keep on looking, so we drive for about an hour further into the woods. By now, it's getting dark, and we're getting worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but no service of course. We turn off onto an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the Forest Service rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That being said, it looked like a 4x4 had been going over the mound, so it's worn now. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over it. Now, there was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove for a few miles down the road, coming across an opening next to a creek. There were some blue traps hanging over a plywood nailed to a tree. That's odd. That said, it was pretty much dark now, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running, and we set up in the tent. After we set up, I start noticing there's a lot of trash in the woods. I see a green bottle on the ground. I took a look at the label and see that it's a bottle of some home and garden insecticide. I was really tired now and thought someone was dumping some garbage here. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage here when we're more than an hour away from the nearest home. We set up camp, have some beers and made chili from scratch. By this time, it's probably 11 PM and we're eating. We noticed a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles don't make sense. It seemed like it was far too bright and wasn't moving. It's a kind of glow you see over a big bright city, and we don't see the light source itself. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it's not campers. The hill was about a quarter of a mile from our campsite, and we investigate. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have done it. However, we had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and two of us decide to look. My other friend decides to stay. He's gonna do some popcorn on the fire. So we start walking towards the light source, and the situation gets stranger. All the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. It could have been beavers, but why would they go all the way around a tree in a perfect circle? We start talking about the ghost in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. As we're almost to the top, my friend falls and yells out. A few seconds later, the light goes out. We look at each other and decide that maybe we don't need to see what it is after all. Walking back in silence and keep on looking back every few seconds, we decide to turn off our flashlights and return to the campsite with the moonlight guiding us. We get a couple of 100 feet from the campsite. I can see my other friend Isaac walking around. He's wearing a hooded coat that I've never seen him wear before. For some reason, he has a paintball gun. That seems odd. We look at each other. The fire's dying down. We don't see the campsite well. Now, we've been gone for an hour. From the distance, it appears as though my friend is looking for something. He kept walking around the site and peering in. When we're almost back to the campsite, we see our friend walk up the road we came from. We figure he's went to the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to our fire waiting for him to return. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of the tent and vomits. After we left, he had a few more drinks apparently. We ask him why he's wandering around with the paintball gun, and he gets a strange face and says, "They're locked in the cab of the truck." "Did you unlock it?" "No." We go to the truck and enter the door code and see our paintball equipment just as we left it before. The keys to the truck are hidden underneath a magnetic fob. I get a sinking feeling. What were you doing after we left? I watched a movie then fell asleep. But wait, you were walking around with a paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets? He said he'd been in the tent the whole time, wearing the same unhooded fleece. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't him. At this point, of course, we're all too drunk to drive, but we decide to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent, we just fold it with the sleeping bags and think, heck, jumping in the F-150. When we get up to the dirt hump, we see something grey blocking our path. The metal barrier that's been laying in the woods is now erect. By this point, we've all sobered up. No one wants to get out of the car to try and move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of my truck, so I slowly tap it. It falls over, and we drive very slowly over it, terrified we're going to pop one of the tyres and be stranded. It didn't. As we drive down the road, we see a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it on the moonlight. I now begin to drive as quick as I possibly can. The vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer though. It just stays 1 or 2 turns behind us, but always follows. After 45 minutes of speeding, we get back to the main paved road. I start to drive everyone back to my home and decide to go a different way. I've never experienced anything like it in my life. Rural camping can be very dangerous, and we've never went back there since. Tonight was one of the scariest things that I've ever witnessed, and I don't know how to explain it. It's my second incident with the same thing, but this one was far scarier than the first. So the first incident I didn't think much about because this last April Fool's Day when my husband and I were driving home from a friend's ranch. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of white as our lights illuminated something by the side of the road in an adjoining field. It looks to be a stark white naked man, but he was running with his hands down like he's an animal and going very fast and parallel to our car in the opposite direction. We both freaked out as hell, but think it's probably an April Fool's joke. We're in the dead center of rural Montana. People get bored and do stupid things. Halloween gets crazy here, so we think it's a prank. Then, tonight happened. I went down the road to where the mailboxes from our street are. It's that rural road delivery setup where you have about 20 mailboxes at the end of the long country road. It's about 200 yards from our house and the moon's out, so I figure I'll walk over to check the mail to go and see if my husband's picked it up. When I get there, I find a neighbour not too far from our door heading out the same way on a walk. So we start talking and she accompanies me to the mailboxes. I take a peek into the box. Nothing. We continue chatting for a few minutes when there's suddenly barking from several of the neighbourhood dogs across from us. One at a time, they begin furiously snarling and barking, a few even howling. My neighbour mentions that there must be coyotes roaming again. Happens all the time. Nothing to worry about. Then suddenly, one of the dogs begins howling in pain. We both look at each other, thinking the same. Time to get the hell out of there. We start walking a bit briskly when she turns to glance over her shoulder for a second time and stops. I turned around and see it as well. It looks like a rather skinny-ish but stone white man, not on his feet but on all fours like an animal, no hair that I can see. The light from my phone got in his eyes for a second more, and it shines back like a cat. There was blood down the front of his jaws, and it all happens in maybe 2 or 3 seconds, so very quick. He then literally bolts after us as we run. My neighbour doesn't chain or fence in her dogs as we're animal lovers, and she likes having the extra protection of them wandering as well. So she starts yelling the dog's name, and he comes running out from his spot between our houses. He must have smelled this thing or heard it coming, because he made an immediate beeline past us, growling like crazy. We reached my husband's working shed, so we hid in there and lock the doors and wait for the cops. All we can do is hide and wait in the shed while she told the cops to come out, hearing the dog barking and attacking whatever that thing was. After a couple of minutes, she's off the phone and we're hiding behind boxes of stuff away from the window. I don't know how long we're there, but before she whispered that the dog isn't barking anymore, and suddenly they're not making any sounds. After a few moments we heard crunching outside. Something starts scratching slow and hard against the front door and part of the wall next to it. I'm not too proud to admit that I weighed myself a little bit, and I throw my hands over my mouth to stop screaming. She was staring at the door, not moving, so I know I wasn't overreacting or anything. It seemed like forever, but eventually we saw the lights from the cops coming up the long road and the scratching stops. Whatever it was ran off because we heard the noise of leaves crunching hard and fast away from the door. She was brave and gets the guts to peek out the window, and the cops are close now. When they got near us, we ran to the cop cars and told them we saw a kind of man who chased us. She pointed out the direction that he had gone in and ran back, mentioning that the sounds of the dogs are in the opposite neighbourhood and away from the mailbox. She said her dog come without us even calling, and we hid in the sheds. The cop takes our statements and said that somebody else had called a few minutes before, and that there was a wolf or something in her backyard that just killed the chickens, and their dog and the neighbour down had actually saw the thing too. The other cops found my neighbour's dog lying on the ground with what appears to be deep claw marks, having trouble breathing. As he's lying there, he gets bundled up, and the vet comes to pick him up, and he mentions how it looks like a bear's attacked. So I'll give a description of both of what the neighbour down from the owner of the dead dog described and what we saw. The neighbour said it looked like a stark white naked man, tall, wearing the skin of a bear or bison, brown furred and head attached, blood coming from the mouth and around the chest, very long arms. She caught him crouching over the dog, turns on the back porch light, and he ran off. What we saw was a pale man without hair, with long arms, eyes that glows like a cat, very quick, reddish glow, animal looking. When he started running after us, it wasn't awkward like a guy trying to run on his hands and feet. It looked like a person now, but it wasn't. This isn't the first time this kind of thing happened. It's not the first time I've heard of odd things. Montana's one of them places where so many weird and unexplainable things happen. But it's not the first time something odd's come after me in the dark. It's been a couple of hours and I'm still shaking. If that was me, I'd make the skinwalker bleed if it touched my dog. I would literally fight to the death over my dog. Skinwalker would be running from me. So for my backstory, my boyfriend and I had just bought our first house in June on a lake about half an hour northeast of Seattle, WA. Aside from the lake community we're part of, There really isn't a large range of population around here. We're in between a few larger towns, but they're all about a 20-minute drive from where we live. Our house is backed right up against a cascade of mountains. We're pretty much the last bit of population before the mountains begin. About 30 yards from our driveway is a dead-end road that turns off the main lake road and goes back into the woods for a few miles. There's a few gated forest service / logging roads that branch off from this. Boyfriend and I ride our dirt bikes up these roads, and they themselves go on for miles. But there really aren't any other houses in the area except for a few that are all on the main road. Before taking the dirt bikes up to it, I love dirt bikes, I had been walking up this road a few times exploring the area, and it always felt a little odd to me. My boyfriend said things like, "This is creepy even in daylight." It totally could have been that it was just very wooded in most spots and therefore shaded. The lack of houses made it odd, but I stopped walking up this road for this reason. When we moved in, I was dog sitting my friend's pit bull Bella. She's about 70 pounds and was a totally fearless brat. Now she's kind of aggressive with other dogs, and even with some people. I would walk her up to the end of the road, and I'd always feel okay because there were no cars or houses around. So one day we were about 2 miles up the main road and had come down a small hill onto a flat, treeless area where there was no old abandoned barn and a large field that cut through the road. There was tall grass on either sides of the road. When we got to the area, Bella's tail went down and she kept her head really low. She also started to look around and back behind us, acting nervous, which is really odd for her. As we're coming around a turn, about 100 yards in front of us is a logging road that went off the road straight up a hill. It had a large gate just at the bottom of it to keep vehicles out. My boyfriend and I have to put our dirt bikes under this gate before riding up the trails, so it's pretty tall. The top of the bar of the gate comes to my chest and I'm 5'5". What I saw still scares me to think about. Standing right in front of the gate is a huge black dog. It was standing broadside with its head low. I'm almost positive it's looking towards us, because I can't make out a snout or ears. I can't see a tail either, but it may have been lowered behind its legs. The shoulder of the thing was higher than the top of the gate. It was blocking part of the view. I stopped instantly and held Bella's harness so she couldn't advance forward and catch sight of it, and this dog's aggressive. I look at this thing for probably 2 seconds before running back and getting back to the main road because I heard this thing growl. I'm not kidding you. 100 yards away from it, I hear this thing, almost hissing. I'm totally terrified, so's Bella now, which is worrying. She's not even seen it. It was a long 2 miles back and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, and Bella's also freaking out the whole time. The growling, massive black dog wasn't the only thing I'm terrified of. I have this also feeling of dread that I can't get away from. Now I saw it, and it was overwhelming, and I've never felt fear like it before. Even while typing this, I'm shaking. I don't even feel safe when I'm home alone anymore. My boyfriend's 100% sure I saw a 6-foot black bear, but I'm certain it wasn't, as I grew up in rural Pennsylvania and have never seen black bears. Now this thing had long skinny legs and a deep curved rib cage. It's similar to a Doberman. Now, wolves don't live in this area. Even if they did, this would have been an abnormally large skinny wolf. I'm pretty sure what I come across is actually a skinwalker. After a stressful day at work, I'd gone over to my friend's apartment to shoot the breeze, eat some food and play a few games on my friend's PlayStation 4. It was getting late and I had to be up fairly early the next day. My friend walked out to the parking lot with me. Now there's no one else in the parking lot, just us two. As I'm unlocking my car, a dog walked out from the side of a nearby building about 25 feet away. It came fully into view and stops to look at us. It was a little bit bigger than a standard Great Dane. It's an all-black dog with long hair that appeared to be falling out in clumps. It has long ears and a scraggly tail. I remember making eye contact with it. It had dark maroon coloured eyes, and in the moment we locked eyes, it appears almost to smile at us. Instead of a dog's lips going up and back, they go slightly sideways, and I see white teeth like a human almost. I recall suddenly getting a feeling of dread and fear. It felt like something disguised as a dog pretending to be one, but it's not. I'm certain of it. The energy coming off this thing doesn't feel right either. I really don't know how to describe it. It turned around and starts slowly limping back to the corner it's come from. My hair goes up. It turned around and slowly starts staring at us before heading off. It seemed to have most of its weight on its front feet, walking like a hunchback. The way it was limping, I noticed its rear left foot is wrapped up in a blue gauze, and the foot appears very odd. The heel was parallel to the ground actually. I'm unsure if my friend saw exactly what I saw, but she suddenly said, "It's leaving, let's follow it," and she ran after the damn thing. And it disappeared right around the corner. I remembered being scared for my friend, so I sprint after her. Around the corner with my friend, looking around confused. The dog? It's gone. At the rate it was walking and limping, it couldn't have got anywhere. The air was suddenly cold, even for South Texas in January. My teeth were chattering. My friend told me to go quickly back to her apartment, lock the door and stay inside. I warned her that this isn't a dog. I text her when I'd gone home. Once at the safety of home, I text my friend and say that I hope this is the end of it, but even as I'm sitting there in bed, my heart is racing. It doesn't help that around 12 AM, there was low whistling right outside my window. My neighbour's house isn't too far from mine, but they're good people and there's no logical reason for them to be that close to my window at night whistling. I didn't make any indication that I was aware of the whistling. It's not even musical, just like somebody trying to get their attention. Eventually, the whistling stops and I hear nothing else. I have a lot of trouble sleeping. I've never seen or experienced anything like this. To the best of my knowledge, it could be a skinwalker. I'm going to try my best to describe this in a cohesive manner. It's been a few years and a lot of stuff happened this night, but it's forever in my memory and haunting. If anyone has an idea what it is, I'd love to hear it. So in July of 2014, I'd been dating my now ex-boyfriend for a couple of months and decided to move in with him. I'm going to change names just for the sake of this. We'll call him Tom. So Tom lives on the Cattaraugus Indian Reservation in western New York. He's 100% Senkar, and his family has properties on reservation land. I'm only 25% Senkar, and because my mum is white, I'm not an enrolled member. So I never grew up going to Longhouse or living on the res because the majority of families are white Catholics. He lives on a side of the major road going through the res called Route 438. One night, we get in a big argument and I'm annoyed and go away for a bit. Living with him full time doesn't offer me a break, so I'm pretty annoyed. What's worse is I don't have a car at the time, so I decide at 2 AM that I'm gonna walk. Anger clouds my judgment, and I had to leave. He kept saying to me to stay and blocks the door, and picked me up and brought me back. He's adamant, but so am I. He was concerned I'd go into weirdos cruising around. I was so angry that I didn't care, and I also grown up walking the woods at night, so never really had an issue. So I walk out the door and up the driveway and start heading down this road. It's pitch black with brush on both sides, but there's a few trailers his aunts and uncles owned. As I get closer to the stop sign where his road ends and connects to Route 438, I see a light heading towards me. I get freaked out and realise it's a person heading towards me. Now, it's not really uncommon for people to be walking by the res at night, but as we got closer, I debate turning back. But I was mad and kept going. Suddenly the person says, "My name?" Then, "What the hell?" I recognise the voice as Tom's cousin that lives in the trailer behind us. I was so relieved that it was him and not a stranger. We stopped to talk and he told me that he's walking home from a party. I told him me and Tom fought and I was heading into town to stay with friends. He told me I was crazy and that it's not safe for girls to walk around at night and said I could stay at his father's trailer for the night. Sounds more logical than walking 9 miles alone. When he headed back towards the end of the road, we get to the trailers and pass a clearing in the brush where the old driveway was. I look into the clearing and I can't really explain what I saw. It was so dark, but I could see whatever this was. It's much darker than the environment around it. It was completely black, to the shape of a skinny but massive human-like shape. It was crouched so its knees are in front of its stomach, but its arms are so long. I was shaking right in this and I can't explain what it appeared to be. I saw it quickly and then looked straight ahead. 3 seconds later, Tom's cousin says, "Did you see that?" And I said yeah, and we instantly start sprinting as fast as possible. He was faster and started yelling, "Just go." We got into his trailer and sat in silence. I think maybe we both saw it and didn't know for sure until we saw each other. The walk felt like it took an eternity. I felt this horrible feeling of being watched. Its arms were massive. They're so long that even crouched or seated, with its knees bent, it's able to keep its back upright and not back like it's supposed to do. It's at least 7 feet tall. I have no idea what it could have been, and I have no experience of anything like it. And my ex would never talk about it, saying I was just seeing things, but his cousin saw it too. A few months ago, my roommates and I are out taking a drive trying to find a fun place to visit. I'll call them S and J for privacy's sake. S was driving and told us about a playground in Skelly that she used to go with a friend, so we decided to check it out. The playground wasn't very special, but it was interesting because it was half old playground equipment that you could tell someone hadn't used in years, and half new equipment. While we're enjoying time over there, I start hearing whispering from the near side of the playground, which didn't freak me out because I've heard them since I was a child. But I called out to Jay and she and I walked over there. By the time S joined us, the whispers had stopped and we're about to head to the car when, out of nowhere, a truck comes speeding down, seemingly from just where we stepped across from earlier. Naturally, when it stopped, we all freeze. We're in the shadows of the trees trying desperately not to be seen because it's near dawn and we don't want to be caught by some random local in the park, especially not within closing hours and get in trouble. But before we knew what was happening, the driver gets out of his truck and stood facing the crossroad that led out, and we suddenly hear a howl sound. It was deep and almost inhuman. It starts out low in pitch, then gets higher. It's a really creepy sound. It goes silent for a few seconds, then starts again for another 5 or 6. What really caught our attention is that we're out in a small country town at night, so there's a lot of birds and insects, but when the driver started howling, everything went dead silent. I mean, everything. After it started its third howl, we ran to the car and sped off. We didn't know what we witnessed, and we definitely felt that something was horribly wrong. S and I drove about 45 minutes home and dropped off Jay at home, only to decide that we want to go back now that the sun's up. But when we arrive back in Cthulhu, we're in for a surprise. First off, there is not a crossroad anywhere close to the playground. There was only a curve in the road, but we distinctly remembered seeing a four-way crossroad under the streetlights. Also, there wasn't a football field that we saw earlier. I know things look different in the dark, but they shouldn't be that different, and all of us remember the same thing. We have no idea what we witnessed that day. It's really crazy, and it seemed almost evil and malevolent. So I had a weird encounter a few months ago, and I feel like maybe this would be a good place to post it. I was sitting in my living room watching TV around 8:30, and it was pretty dark outside. All of a sudden, I heard knocks on my door, so I get up to see who's there. No one I know ever knocks on the door, they just walk in. So anyway, and standing on my porch are three guys. Just one look at them and I'm scared. They seem almost like caricatures of humans, but ones that walk straight out of hell and onto my doorstep. They were dressed up like Mormon boys in suits, but their name tags only said Jesus Christ. They never introduced themselves and kept asking for people by name. Honestly, I can't convey how uncomfortable it made me feel. I barely remember their faces, but the one in the middle was just smiling the entire time. I don't know how, but my instincts told me that these aren't normal people, and I should never have opened the door. Now, I get out of the conversation by saying I'm cold and don't really have a good time talking. Now I slammed the door and I never saw or heard from them again. It's been a few months now and I still have no idea who they were to this day. I always loved the chance to get out into national forests and parks. I really like jogging. I find a true tranquility when I'm going through them with nothing but the cool summer's air with me. I would do it in winters too, but it was a lot worse because obviously the leaves were very slippery and you wouldn't always see people about outside of the occasional park ranger. But this story took place on one summer's evening. I was feeling really good. I made a playlist and was listening to some podcasts while I was jogging. I set out at about 9 PM, so it was still kind of light outside. As I was jogging, I couldn't help become more and more aware of how dark it seemed to be getting, quick, and I mean almost too quick. I'd go on my phone for literally less than 5 minutes, and when I looked up, it got noticeably darker. Not just in the sense of my eyes adjusting, I mean it was a weird feeling, and I feel like somebody's watching me. I decide just to try and walk back because I'm getting really tired now, which is another strange thing. I've come to realise it might have been my body's response to fear, but I felt drained and really tired, in a way that I've never felt it before. I decide to press on regardless, cycle through my songs and feel good again. Now as I'm walking, I realise that there's a mist that's setting over the park. Now this is something that I've never experienced before. Well, I have, just not in the summertime, so it's something that I found very strange. I start to hear interference with my headphones too, and think it might be because of the moisture from the fog and take them off. That's when I realise that I can hear a hissing sound. It's not a normal sound that you would hear from electric interference, it's almost like an animal making it, but I've never heard it before, and my heart drops. The feeling of being watched overpowers me now. I feel darkness like I've never felt before, like true evil's around. I think maybe there's a park ranger there with his radio messing up. I call out but I don't hear anyone. I suddenly think it is a bad idea to call out and I begin jogging. As I start jogging, I hear a crash behind me. I turn to look, and there's a very tall dark figure just off beside a tree. Now what terrifies me is that there's a tree that's been knocked over that was standing before. I know for a fact that it's either a 1 in a billion chance it fell then and none of the other trees did, or something menacing's following me. Now this thing has to be at least 6'2" and has long arms. It sounds like it's describing exactly me so far. I can't see any eyes, but I can tell that this thing's facing directly towards me. I wipe my eyes, and it doesn't move. I say, hey, if this is a ranger, you need to stop because I'm scared now. And I'm met with silence. It slowly moves behind the tree. I've seen enough now. I can't deal with this. I go into a fight or flight state and I'm literally frozen for a second. I tell myself, no, I'm not going out like this, and I start sprinting as quick as I can. The whole time I'm running, I can hear this thing chasing just behind me. I get to the car park and there's no other cars there, so it's me alone now. Great. So if this thing attacks me, I'm screwed. I jump into my truck and drive as quick as I possibly can, getting out of the wooded area. Now the craziest thing is, this thing's still following me. I can hear things breaking behind me, like a very tall and very heavy thing's chasing me through the woods. I'm literally screaming and praying for God to help me out in this moment. I can just about see him in my mirrors, but it's very foggy at the time. I have to slam on the brakes at one point too because I nearly hit a tree because how dense the fog had become. I continue driving and eventually make it back onto the main road. I'm literally crying the entire time. I end up going to a ranger station and explaining what I saw, and they say I'm not the only one that's reported something similar. People have been reporting it as a bear, but it's not possible because there's no bears in this specific area. I have no idea what it was, and nor do the park rangers, but they say I wasn't the only one who had that reaction. And there was a strange smell that accompanied that thing. I didn't get that close to find out, but everyone described it exactly the same as me. They're already doing patrols trying to find that thing, but they never found it. It still shakes me to my core thinking about it to this day. So this didn't happen to me, but I live in the area where it took place. My friend and I were discussing the scariest things that we've seen in the woods, and he told me a story that happened to his friend. So this guy was with 5 of his friends and was spending a few days in a cabin hunting and trapping. They were not drunk but had a few beers to unwind one night, so one of them goes out to the outhouse to use the bathroom. He can hear some faint beating sounds in the distance like a low drum. So he finishes in the outhouse and goes into the cabin to tell his friends to come and check out the sound. So they all grab their rifles and walk out the ridge of their cabin, down the holloway behind it and up the other side. It's a pretty rocky area, so the sound travels far. They could tell that it's just over the hill, so 5 of them spread out about 50 feet and walk up to the top. They can't see completely over there because there's large bushes around them. Now, they just sneak down and try and see what it is. One of them goes over there, and he stands there and watches for about 30 seconds to a minute, before telling his friends that they have to run as quick as they can, and saying what he saw was evil and they need to get out of there now. He said all he could see was a bunch of naked people dancing around a fire pit with some kind of pentagram on the floor. He never told them about everything he saw. He just said he was too scared ever to go back in the woods again or near that area. I was born and raised in Charlotte, NC, and still live on the east side. There's a local public park near my parents' house called McAlpine Creek, which was mainly a large cross-country trail stretching miles across East Charlotte. The park is enveloped by hundreds of acres of dense forest and underdeveloped land that is discreetly placed amidst busy streets and highways. You almost don't realise it because of the stretches of infrastructure around it. There's a myth and folklore tale about a devil church or satanic ritual area deep within that park. There's a few videos of people trying to find it. Now in my senior year of high school, after searching around the internet, I heard about where this is supposed to be and decided I want to find it. So my girlfriend and I at the time decided to try and find it on the road that leads into the church. We end up driving down miles of winding roads behind a car max that borders the dense woods of the park where a small neighbourhood of sorts is. I think I got in the two street names wrong, but they're very close to the spot. Now cautiously driving down these quiet and dark roads, we found a seemingly abandoned dirt track offshooting from the paved road. Keep in mind that there's almost no streetlights anywhere. We're driving about another 2 or 3 minutes and there had been a pickup truck behind us for maybe 50 feet or so. Upon seeing the dirt track and everything else around, our interest had peaked. We stopped the car to discuss what we want to do. We began to slowly pull onto the dirt track simultaneously. The pickup truck ahead abruptly stops and stays in place. We notice this, having pulled finally into the dirt road at this point. We're immediately frozen in panic. The driver of the truck quickly puts their car into reverse and began to immediately back up towards us at max speed. I throw my car into reverse and panic in an attempt to back away from where we come from. I was able to get turned around and drive back into the woods fairly quickly. The driver's accelerating at us at full speed now and I have to floor it to try and get out of there. We literally never look back. We never ended up finding the church and have no idea who was following us in the woods that day. I'm not sure if this is the right place for this, but when I went to high school in a small Minnesota town, mostly farmland intersected by wooded areas, and of course dozens of small lakes. One side of my neighbourhood was bordered by a relatively large marshland that you could access by a slope that wound down a trail. This trail curves through the marsh into a big patch of woods, about 3/4 of a mile away. In the fall or spring, after heavy rain, a fog would often settle over the marshes, as it was much lower than the surrounding area. It really looks like something out of a Stephen King novel. After one of these rains, my brother and I, he's probably about 13 and I was 16 at the time, decided it's a great idea to explore the woods in the fog. Although the sun was setting fast, we knew that we could make it into the woods in about 10 minutes if we left immediately. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, knowing that it would get dark by the time we got home, and we head for the trail. Once we're in the trail and moving, it hit us just how thick the fog is. We'd only been walking for about a minute or two, but we have absolutely no visibility behind us, and 5 to 10 feet max in front of us. So we continue walking for a few more minutes, saying about now we come up to a curve in the trail. This curve signalled that we're only about 100 yards from the entrance of the woods. At this point, there's a small lake on the left side of the trail and some marshland further to the right. Now we began walking past the lake when we hear a splash. Definitely much bigger than a fish jumping, almost like a person done it. It's a really strange sound. Now we couldn't have been up there for more than 15 seconds when we heard cracking and shuffling in the brush up ahead to our left. We stopped dead in our tracks and waited. At the end of our eyesight, which could only have been about 10 feet, a figure steps out from the brush bordering the fog. Now, it's so thick that we can't make out details, but he must have been about 6'4" and very broad-shouldered. As this figure made its way into the middle of the trail, my brother gasped and stopped. Its head shot over and looks right at us. It felt like it must have been an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. I felt true terror in that moment that I've never felt before. I began to take a small step backwards, and suddenly, the figure took over into the marshland running again. There were no houses or buildings or anything for miles in the direction that we ran. We kept on sprinting until we got back home, and we never went back to that area again. I grew up in the Midwest US. When I was a senior in high school, I was out for a hike at a local trail in the National Forest. This is a good 20 miles from town, way out in the sticks. It's a box canyon, so you start at the rim and hike down into the canyon. It was autumn and late afternoon when I pulled into the empty parking area, but there's plenty of light around. But by the time I got to the bottom, the sun's pretty low. I was down in the canyon and get the feeling that something isn't quite right. I start looking behind me as I walk every few steps. I can't shake this feeling. Finally, on one of these backward glances, I spotted a man peeking out from behind a tree, not far at all, maybe 100 feet away. It was the weirdest thing to catch somebody watching me. He knew I'd seen him and stepped out saying, "I'm not looking to scare you." He's a big adult male, very old looking, and I'm a scrawny 16-year-old kid, and we're on a trail in the public park. There's no reason to hide like that. He seems alarmed that I've even seen him. The only reason he was out there is if he's weird. I mumble something about getting back to my car, and this horrifying grin comes across his face. He's just standing there staring at me. I'm running for a long time and I can still tell that he's watching me. And when I get back to the parking area, there's no cars other than mine, which added to the weirdness. I realised later that he must have been out there for some time because of the state of his clothes. It's interesting how when you get the sensation that you're being watched, it's normally true. I have no idea what his intentions were. I'm just really glad that I was aware of what was going on and he didn't spring up on me, because I don't know what he was capable of. I went to a summer camp in a rural part of New Jersey back in the mid-1990s. The camp was situated on a long, narrow man-made lake. One end of the lake was reserved for swimming, which we'd do as a group activity every day or so. The swimming area had one long dock stretching straight out onto the water. The two square floating docks further apart. One of the two floating docks is further away, and although I had spent a few summers at this camp, I'd never seen anybody use the second dock. One day on the group, a dozen 11-year-olds got to the bright idea that we're going to swim out to the faraway dock. I consider this to be a challenge. When we reached the dock, I noticed a strange looking spider on the ladder that you had to climb up. I would have a heart attack. It was quite large, in terms of overall footprint. Probably 3 inches from end to end. Nah, screw that. Spiders, of course, are normal critters in nature, but this one stood out as looking unusual. After the long swim, we took a few minutes to lie on the dock and rest in the sun. No way did they just go over that spider like that. It was relaxing and we were all having a good time. We started really messing around and decided to play around for a bit. We're playing a regular game where we shuffle towards one corner of the dock, making it sink. Oh god. As the corner of the dock starts to sink and fill with water, suddenly hundreds of giant spiders come, oh god, frantically crawling out from between the boards, swarming over around the feet of those who are still standing on the dry ground. This dock was theirs apparently. We all began to scream immediately and jump up trying to get away, but the spiders are in the water too. I vividly remember the feeling of them clinging to my wet hair as I began hopelessly trying to get them off. Adrenaline kicks in and we swim to the other side that's spider free, but this is a childhood trauma that lingers with me. I had not really been afraid of spiders before, but this is a turning point. The thought of us lying on the dock in the sun, unaware to how many of them were there, creeps me out to this day. That is literally hell on earth. This happened about 5 years ago now. I had gone through a rough breakup, and I was going through a phase where I wanted to be more independent, self-efficient, and generally more okay being alone. I would go to a lot of movies and restaurants by myself, etc. At the time, I'm living in Montana, where spending time outdoors is a prime recreation. Camping solo seems to be a very good exercise in truly being self-reliant, so I packed a little tent and went to the Jerry Johnson hot springs. Jerry Johnson is a natural hot spring with a few small, mostly natural pools of water in the mountains on the border of Montana and Idaho. I'm trying to keep this as brief as possible as I don't want to go into too much detail. What I will say is that it's truly in the middle of nowhere. From the interstate, it's about 1/3 of a mile hike across a bridge into the woods, and from the interstate, it's about a 45-minute drive in either direction that you've come from before you find any kind of civilization, which is only in the form of a gas station. There isn't a motel or anything attached to the hot springs like you get in some places. It's literally nothing but forest land with a few tiny ponds of warm water, and if you ever go, you'll probably be the only one there. There's plenty of daylight, so I decide I'll go and soak first, and then set up my camp when I'm finished. I make the short hike to find that there's a couple, a man and a woman in their late 30s-ish, in the main pool, and they look very startled at the sight of me. I say a friendly hello from a distance as I approach. At first they don't even reply, just stare. Then the guy pipes up, "What are you doing, man?" I tell him I'm confused. He then says, "Is that you that's been creeping around the woods watching us for the last hour?" I assure them that I have no clue what they're talking about, and they begin telling me that there's someone in the woods way off the trail. Apparently, they've been yelling at him and he doesn't respond. He'll walk away into the woods for a while and reappear somewhere, just watching. After they've been assured that it isn't me, I get undressed and get into the water. Their pupils are huge, like they've ate some mushrooms. I've never asked, but it seems pretty obvious. It's not a big deal. It's basically the perfect setting for it, I guess, but it makes me wonder what they're doing. We talk for a while, first about the creepy guy and then other stuff on the mood lightings, and I'm relieved not to be alone now. I'm a relatively large guy, and I guess there's strength in numbers. No more sightings of the creeper. They get out before me. I'm in the pool by myself for about 10 minutes before I hear shouting in the woods. I decide to cut my soak short, just in case someone's in trouble. I get out, dry off quickly, and get dressed still moist, and I hear a shout. I start quickly hiking. I eventually come across a couple shouting off into the woods things like, "We've got a gun," which they don't. I ask what's going on, and they say the guy was just ominously standing in the path looking at them in the distance. When they started to shout, apparently he retreats into the woods, now out of sight. For all of this though, they never got a good look at him. We walk back to our cars, decide we'll camp near each other. There's an official campground, but you have to pay. The guy tells me he knows another spot which is relatively flat that would work. I agree and follow them. It's not very far. They set up their tent and I set up mine about 100 yards away. I want to give them plenty of space to trip or whatever else they're gonna do there. We're in a dry season, on raw forest floor, so neither of us made a campfire. I got all set up and just sat around reading a book and enjoying nature. The mosquitoes made me retreat into my tent at about 6 PM, and by 9 I'm asleep. At about midnight, I was awoken by the sound of screaming. I grab my flashlight and .22 pistol, put on some shoes but don't tire them, and start running towards the other tent. When I arrived, the two men were standing outside of the tent with their own flashlights completely losing it. They said they'd been there, and apparently the guy was there too. They showed me a slice in the wall of their tent that apparently he made with a knife. They haphazardly packed their stuff and hurried away, getting back to their cars. I only realised that I hadn't grabbed my own stuff. I say if they could go back with me and they said, "Sorry man, you're on your own." I thought about it for a minute. I could come back the next day and get my stuff, but It was over an hour drive in any direction. I did have a gun, but if someone shot at me, even in self-defense, that would be begging another kind of nightmare that would last the rest of my life. I decided I would go back for my stuff. I killed my flashlight and basically went stealth ninja mode back into the trees surrounding the clearing where my tent is. My thought was that if it was really quiet, then I could hear him, but he couldn't hear me. It took me about another 20 minutes to get to where my tent was. When I got back to my tent, it's untouched. I quickly threw on my backpack, put my flashlight in my mouth, grabbed my tent in its fully assembled state with my sleeping bag, still inside, and ran back to the car with a loaded .22 revolver in my hand, stabilizing the awkward tent. I get back to my car and drove away. Now, what didn't really occur to me until later is that I never actually saw that guy, and to this day, I can't even be sure if he was actually there in the woods. I kind of doubt that these people would have sliced their own tent, but at the same time, they were happily hanging out in the wilderness all day, miles away from others. It's possible that they were just messing with me, but if so, they deserve an Oscar, because they seemed absolutely terrified. I hate to think what would have happened if I hung around to find out the truth. I was in the woods with 3 friends at night. A friend's house was nearby, and I was getting hungry, so I went inside to find some food. Another friend came inside with me. 2 friends were still outside. Later on, one of the other 2 who were outside comes in and sees the indoor friend on the couch next to me. They panic and immediately run back outside. I poke my head out the door asking what's going on, and they yell loudly, "That's not Kevin." Everyone come inside and calms down a bit, and the story comes out. They thought the person indoors is with me, Kevin, and have been outside the entire time with them. Why? Because in the darkness of the woods they see a silhouette about the same height walking alongside them silently. Then at some point it ran away, and they were chasing it thinking it's Kevin. The reason my friend called out "that's not Kevin" was to stop the last outdoors friend from chasing whoever there was deeper into the woods. We still have no idea who it was to this day. I grew up in the Midwest about 10 years ago, and I moved to a small coastal town in the Pacific Northwest. When I worked there, I worked for a company that runs cable rentals and a water taxi service, transporting campers and hunters, and sometimes freight to various locations. Sometimes just 20 minutes away, others it was hours. Now during the winter a few years ago, we had a couple staying in one of the very basic cabins, like the kind you get at summer camp. My understanding was the guy Dick was taking a class at the trade school in town, so he'd be gone all day, while the woman Jane stayed at the cabin with their 3 dogs. We never saw her outside while he was away. Now one day, Jane burst into the cabin in tears, being hysterical. She told us Dick had been beating her for days, starving her, that he'd been locking her in the cabin while he was away, that he even threatened her with his dogs. So we immediately called the police, and while we waited for them to arrive, she told us the details of their relationship. Jane's from South Africa and a wealthy family. Her father recently passed away and she got some inheritance. She'd met Dick on a social media site, and he sold her on some bogus dream of building on a remote lodge. He convinced her to transfer all of this money, and apparently he was spending it on property. Jane was totally at Dick's mercy. She voluntarily transferred the money to him. It was evident that she'd grown up wealthy. She didn't have an idea of how to care for herself. By the time the police arrived, she had reversed her story. She wouldn't tell them that he'd hit her, threatened her, or locked her in the cabin. I walked over to the other side of the cabin to talk to Dick with the officer, and of course, he denied everything. The cop was very frustrated. It was clear Dick was mistreating her, but he didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest. I told Dick that he needed to leave the property anyway. I didn't want him there, and the woman didn't want to go with him. Jane managed to get in touch with a friend in the US who brought her a plane ticket, and another employee and I offered to drive her to the airport in the city, about 200 miles away. Now that very night, Dick left without any issues, and the last thing I said to him was that he can't come back, and if I ever saw his truck in the area again, I'm gonna call the police and assume the woman's in trouble with no hesitation. I really felt terrible for the woman. She basically made a bad investment and had little hope of recovering the money. Months had passed. It was well into the summer, and I'd forgotten about the incident. I had heard Jane had gone back to Dick, and they're out in town. This is from another taxi operator. He'd been transporting them to and from their remote property because Dick wrecked the boat he bought with Jane's money on a rocky beach. One day, I answered a phone call from a very distraught woman from the other side of the country. She was desperately trying to find her son, who answered, and Dick had posted online looking for help to construct his remote property. She'd just been calling water taxi operators to ask if they knew this guy Dick. Apparently, her son Mike had called from a satellite phone out of the property and told her he was in danger. They weren't getting along, and Dick finally ran him off the property. The property was out in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by sea or air with no roads. You can't tell someone to leave because they don't know where to go. Mike's mother relayed to me that Dick wouldn't let him sleep in the cabin, that he wouldn't share food and would even chase him with a rifle when he realised Mick had a satellite phone. It was lucky he managed to call them out. Mike's mother called with the intention of hiring us to pick up her son. I said to her, "Miss, this is an emergency, you need to call the police." And I contacted the police and Coast Guard immediately, and they jointly dispatched a boat and helicopter to the area to rescue this guy. Mike is rescued safely, and Dick was arrested. Jane was there too, but refused to come back with the police and stayed at the cabin. Mike came out to the office a few days later. He gave me a big hug and says thank you. He was convinced I'd saved his life, which was a nice statement, but in my opinion, it's the police and Coast Guard that actually saved him. Now, he gave me some details of the experience, that Dick had actually taken several shots at him for a while chasing him through the woods. He told me when Dick caught up to him, he held him at gunpoint, made him naked and locked him in a shipping container that's on the property, convinced he was gonna die. He was still locked in the container when the police arrived. Mike never stayed for long, but I was impressed that he took the time to come out introducing himself, and I wished him luck. Dick is charged with attempted murder, but they were dropped. Mike ended up with a hefty settlement from the inheritance money that Dick swindled from Jane. I received a phone call later that summer from a property and a reporter in the city. These were asking about what happened. I agreed to tell him what I knew on the condition that he doesn't mention my name or that of the company I work for. The other night I was having a few beers with my old neighbour Al. A young guy had moved into town last year. The story popped into my head, and when I mentioned Dick's name, he perked up. They worked together at a shipyard. I can't believe it, this guy's back in town, without Jane this time working a minimum wage job. So in Canada, we have a scout system similar to the US. Our system by level is Beavers, Cubs, Scouts, and Venturers, so this happens during the Cubs. So, there was this house on the property of the camp. It's beautiful. It's a really nice wooden one. I really like it there. Now during this time, all the troops around us gathered for a camping weekend at the house. There was maybe 7 troops gathered. We'd be doing wooden car racing, etc. The house is split into 2 rooms, one for males and one for females, and there was a closet door that connected the rooms. At the time there's about 20 guys in one room and about 15 females. We'd be sleeping on the floor with our sleeping bags. After brushing, me and the guys went back to the guys' room. We're talking about things and one of the kids said that this place is haunted and that the closet that leads into the girls section is where somebody was hanged. Now I'm not gonna lie, I always felt strange in that doorway, so much so in fact that I specifically put my sleeping bag across the other side of the room. There was also an air vent there, and I'm afraid of it, so then I move in the middle of the night and try and get between the 2 things. Now on that night, after the counsellors shushed us to sleep, cause you guys know we talk for hours on end if we can't sleep. It's around 4:30, I'm awoken, my head facing towards a closet. I notice that something is going down. The closet door is slowly opening. I was kinda stunned. Girls shouldn't be peeping on guys. Then when I saw the shadow, no bigger than 6 foot, it was crazy tall for its size. Now, best I can describe this from memory is like the colour Vanta black. It was very blurry but crisp until in the middle. It slowly inches its way across the wooden floorboards, no sounds even. It just silently passed each kid as it went by. I didn't want this thing to see me, so I turned my head. It passes more kids. Now I really don't want it to see me, so I'm really trying to lay low, but I'm trembling. I don't know what it wanted. It kept moving slowly, passing a few kids ahead of me, then it happened. The closer it got, the more I felt dread. Not only did I feel dread, but the air's getting colder physically. I felt the strangest sensation when it passes me too. I was maybe a feet from the door, so when it went to the other entrance I'm at, I'm not joking, it was literally turning the doorknob. It pulled the door open and slowly exited. Before, strangely enough, the door shuts itself. That morning, we're getting up from bed and walk down the rickety old steps. One of the kids said, "Did you guys see the shadow last night?" And maybe 4 kids' eyes widened. We all blurted yes. We talked about it for a short time, and let's just say, after that experience, everyone's sleeping bag was on the other side of the room. So this isn't related to hiking directly, but I was out in the country lands of Texas, on this remote trail mountain bike that I like to ride when in town. While riding through, I saw an older man ahead of me walking very strangely. I remembered him looking up at the sky. I see him about 60 yards ahead. It's a single track, so I don't have room to go around him, so I simply stop and he hears me brake and turns to me with his head level staring at me. What happened to me next is what made my skin crawl. He starts talking and waving his arms around, but his voice sounds nothing like he looks. It's kind of like a child talking and screaming at the same time, but this guy's obviously in his 50s. He kept talking, but it's like somebody playing a recording from his body with animations not lining up to what he's saying. I turn around and book it back to where my car is and left quickly. Now, he could have easily been a lunatic with a child's voice, but there's no other cars at the trail entrance, and he's a good 5 miles in with no gear or clothes of that of a hiker. God, I hate remembering his voice in my head. It still haunts me. I used to love to go camping in national forests and parks. It truly was one of my favourite pastimes, and to be honest, it was something I didn't really do enough. Now, I was lucky enough to live very close to a national forest, and I did take advantage of this many times. I pretty much always go hiking with a few of my friends. We'd have a good time. We didn't necessarily have to do much, but just sitting there talking to each other always made it fun. There was one summer's evening that we all went out on, and we're having really good laughs on the drive there. One of my friend's cars broke down, but it shouldn't have been funny, but we just found it hilarious because it happened to the guy where things always go left to him. Now as we're driving, we're joking about, imagine if something happens to us today and we haven't even got enough cars to get back, and we're all laughing about this. We eventually get to the park and put both of the cars to the side. We get all of our stuff out, turn on a radio and start walking. We've left too late and nightfall's already upon us. We probably should have set up our camp in one of the designated spots, but we weren't really thinking clear at the time. We're drinking a few beers along the way too. One of my buddies has a massive torch and he breaks that out. And I'm not joking with you, it's literally brighter than daylight, it feels like. It hurts my eyes even looking near it, but it gives us more than enough light for what we're doing. Eventually, of course, that runs out of battery, and we're basically guided by the moonlight. We eventually find a spot and all of us stop and set up our tents. As we're doing so, I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. I keep thinking I see things in the shadows, but I'm sure my eyes are just playing tricks on me, so I continually tell myself that it's my mind playing tricks on me. Now there's a point where I have to get up to pee. My buddy Kevin's already went ahead of me. I can hear him making this stupid screeching sound in the forest. I just start really laughing to myself. When I'm walking I say, "Kevin, I thought your voice should have dropped by now." I continue walking to a spot that's out of the way of the others. Now as I'm doing so, I can hear Kevin trying to sneak up on me. He's just moving in and out of the tree line, just close enough that I can still see him. As I turn, I can't stop laughing because it's so obvious what he's doing and it's really not scaring me. I don't even bother talking to him and I continue walking. Now from here, I can see that Kevin's actually walking on a bit of a bank. He's 6'1" or 2" now when he's normally 5'8". His arms look kind of weirdly long and I think that he's put his hands inside of his shirt to make them look different. That's when it hits me. This isn't Kevin. In a heartbeat, I scream and start sprinting back towards the others. I can hear them go dead silent as they're confused as to what's actually going on. They think I'm playing a prank on them, and when I get to them they're all laughing. Then somebody speaks up and says, "Were you the one making them screamy sounds in the woods?" It's Kevin. He can tell by the look on my face that we need to get out of there, and without saying another thing, we pack up all of our things and get to the trucks as quick as we possibly can. We even drove the one that had the flat tire, but it doesn't matter now, we need to get out of there. As we're saying this, the whole time my buddy's explaining to me, I thought we were being followed but I never said it. There was some tall thing following us in the tree line. I just thought I was being stupid. I frantically said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And he said, "I thought my mind was playing tricks on me." I'm really struggling to explain what I saw. Now I know for a fact that whatever was following me wasn't a normal person, or at least couldn't be made by a normal person because of the sounds it made. When I realised that it wasn't Kevin walking on the bank and this thing really was massive, it really shook me to my core. We went straight to the park ranger and he said that there was other people reporting that there was something over 6 feet moving through the forest at a jogging pace. It never seemed to let up. People described it as having fur covering its body and almost glowing eyes. They were the ones who saw this in the daylight. They sent out a patrol and couldn't find anything. All they reported was a strange odour that wouldn't seem to leave the forest. I never went camping like that again, and even if I hear animals scream, it always brings me back to that moment and realising that it was not Kevin. Now, doing nighttime jogs was one of my favourite things. It was really nice to be out by the street lights, and I never dared really to go towards a real forest because I kind of thought they were quite creepy. Once or twice I actually got caught out in the forest and it did scare me a bit. I remembered one time that most of my friends had actually gone away and I was basically on my own. So I decided that I should probably do some exercise just to keep my mind happy. Now, my brother had actually went on holiday too, and I kind of regretted not going. The thing was, I went away with these guys before and I really come to not enjoy it much, and I just thought it would be a waste of money to do so again. A lot of people were telling me to go, but I just couldn't justify the money and time, and heck, it was only going to be about 1 week. Now, I wasn't actually working at this time, so I was probably especially bored. And like I said, most of my friends had all went away on this one trip, so there wasn't much I could do. And I lived at home with my mum and dad at the time, so I'd actually be quite bored and not really have anything to do whatsoever. It kind of sucked where they lived because it wasn't close to a gym or much of anything, and I don't know, I just thought that was really boring for me. So yeah, I was doing one of my regular jogs and I decided to go through the forest on this one particular day. I didn't really check the time and I'd actually originally decided to walk, so I didn't expect to be jogging. But for whatever reason that bug kicked off on me and I go off into the woods. Now, I spent too long on my phone and the next thing I knew, it was already dark, like really dark. So I was out there trying to find my way back when suddenly I hear the sound of a dog. Now, this thing is barking really loud, like it kind of makes me jump every time that I hear it like that, and it doesn't let up. It goes on for about a good 10 minutes before I realise that it's getting closer, and this thing sounds menacing, and there's no owner chasing it by the way, so I'm pretty convinced that I need to get out of here. I quickly jump up on the bench and there's an old structure there, and I hear the barking get closer and closer, and then I can see it. Now, I don't know for certain if this is a wolf or not, but my god does it look like one. It looks much bigger than normal dogs, and within a second I'm on top of this structure. And this thing is honestly like a bat out of hell, but coming straight for me. It jumps up so high that it almost reaches over to get me, and it falls back down again and I start screaming for help. I scream a few times and I'm met with only the sounds of the trees moving from the wind, and I realise I'm on my own. And this dog does not give up, or wolf, whatever it is. It's literally trying to climb on top to get me. I go to kick its head when it comes up, but I realise it might bite my foot and drag me down with it, so I decide not to. I don't have any idea how to train myself or what I can possibly do if it comes, so I just get ready to fight basically. Now, this freaking thing does not let up for a good 40 minutes. What's worse is my phone that wasn't very good at the time had completely run out of charge, so it's just me, myself and I up here trying to get away from this thing. The other thing too is I was quite cold because I wasn't moving much, so I was worried about getting too cold and being in another kind of danger or getting pneumonia. I don't really know how it works, but you can read between the lines of what I was scared of. Eventually, I hear a very loud crash of lightning, and it disappears. I'm too scared to actually look over the edge of this building because I'm certain that it's going to be there again, but it's completely gone. Now, annoyingly for me, there's an inside part, and this animal could have easily ran and hid inside it and I wouldn't have known. So now I'm stuck with a dilemma. I can stay where I am or try and make my way out of there, but I know realistically this thing could run and get me. I decide that I don't have much of a choice now, so I decide to dangle down my headphone cable and actually drop my headphones in case it runs out. But nothing happened. I then have a more ingenious idea and wait for the next flash of lightning, which is actually scarily close to me, to illuminate the surroundings just enough, and I can see that this thing is gone. Now that's what doesn't make sense to me. Within a second, no actually less than a second, this animal completely disappears. So yeah, it was pretty weird that this had happened. I'm very scared and convinced myself that this is the end, and I'm just prepared to go up trees, and while I'm walking back to civilization, I'm always looking for the closest one I can get to. Eventually I make it back to safety, and I ended up jogging home because I was cold. I didn't really tell my parents about what had happened, but I was a little bit concerned about that thing I'd seen. It honestly looked like a wolf, but somehow different. I don't know if it was a new species or what, but I know for a fact that they're not native to the land that I live on, so there 100% shouldn't have been one there, and that creeped me out. Now interestingly, that's not the only scary thing that happened to me when I'd been out in the woods on my own doing some exercise. I remembered that another time I was walking in an area that I thought I knew pretty well when I noticed the path ahead's blocked. There's an old burnt out car which is completely blocking my way, and it's quite weird because it almost looks like the car's just been burnt a few seconds ago, but if you get close to it, it doesn't feel warm at all, and there's no people, no fire engine, and not enough of the ground is burnt, to be honest. The ground should be burnt completely over, but it really doesn't look like it, and I think this is really odd. Not to worry too much though, I have a plan B. I can go all the way around, and that's what I try and do. Now I make it a little bit further up ahead, and I realise that there's a gate which I should be able to scale over and make my way back to a main road. Now I have to be careful here because the gate is a pretty big one, and I don't want to get my legs stuck and probably bleed, because that could be just as dangerous. Or obviously I could hit my head, but you get the point. Now I come up to another area that I'm familiar with, and it's just open land. That's when I realise something moving up ahead. I stay completely still for a few seconds and try and figure out what it is, and I can see that there's a person walking. Not just one, there's multiple. There's 5, then 6, then 7 people all walking in a single file line. They're wearing some kind of overalls, but they're carrying something, and I can't make out what it is. Now I can't be certain, but there's a very large box which they're carrying on their heads. And weirdly when they're walking, they don't seem to make a sound whatsoever. And this is something that really creeps me out. I actually don't have a clue how they move so silently in this kind of situation, but they did. Whatever they're carrying seems to be really heavy, but they're not making any signs of struggling. Now they walk off into the trees literally and disappear. The thing I didn't get is the way they walked is literally straight into some really dense, like, I don't know what you call it, but like plants and things. But they should have made noise and they shouldn't have been able to walk so directly into it. But guess what? They did. And that still freaks me out to this day. So yeah, as you can imagine, for about 5 or 6 years I didn't actually go into the woods whatsoever. Not really for anything, I just didn't see the point because I actually got bored of it all. I know it looks beautiful and great, but after a while it can become quite the same. But for some reason I started to get that bug in me again to go back out into the forest and just jog. And what do you know, I ended up doing it quite regular, which is back to the start of my story. It was one of those days and I decided that I was going to go further into the forest. Now, this was actually during a summer's day, so everything was really warm and dry, which was great. You did have a number of different insects and bugs that you had to be careful for, but that wasn't too much of an issue. I made my way into quite a nice open area, and I jogged for about a good 10 minutes before stopping. I actually should have brought some kind of longer bottoms, but I didn't, so my legs were getting cut up pretty nastily while I was jogging. So I took a while to sit down and just relax and listen to some music, and I had a grand old time. That's when I could smell smoke. Now it took me a few seconds because initially I thought it was a barbecue, like don't ask me why, but this is exactly what I thought. And suddenly I realised that it feels too warm where I am, and honestly, for a second I thought I might have passed away or something. It was that weird. Everything has this glow to it, and I realised that there's a fire, and a big one. Not only that, some of the houses near me have actually caught fire. I look around to see how far the fire goes, and then I realise it doesn't stop. Literally all around me is fire, and there doesn't seem to be anywhere I can go. I start panicking now. As I look over, all I can see is a very tall wall which protects something. I don't know what it is, it's like trains or whatever, but it's impossible for me to climb it, literally. Even if you're the best in the world at parkour or climbing, there's no way that I'm going to get over it. Now, the fire actually begins spreading, and it's kind of coming parallel to me. It means it's not going directly to where I am, but I can see any opportunity for escape getting narrower and narrower, and I decide to assess the situation. I quickly take the deepest breath that I can, and I jog towards it. I didn't realise how quickly I'd get out of breath doing so, but I now quickly scan my surroundings. I certainly can't jump through this, and I can't hear any fire engines or anything, so I know I'm in big trouble. There is a kind of canal thing that runs off. I don't know whether it's a stream actually, but I know that that's dangerous too because the water runs very quick through here. And I realise that if the fire does spread on either side, I'm gonna drown trying to escape. And then I have to catch my breath again, so I sprint back in the exact direction that I've just come from. I now start to scream and swear, calling out for help as quickly as I can. I managed to call through to the fire department, and they say that they're aware of the situation just to stay where I am and that help's coming. They tell me don't move whatever I do, but I say no, I'm gonna move. And I say I'm gonna turn off my phone now because I need to save the battery, so I do so and don't listen to their reply. Within those couple of seconds that I made the call, the fire actually starts spreading at a much quicker pace now, and it starts to engulf me, and I realise that I have no other options of what to do. I start to get as much air into my lungs as possible and try and breathe out all of the carbon dioxide that might be in my system. I take one last breath and I dive into the water. Immediately I hit my head and I start bleeding because I've gone into some rocks, because the water's actually less deep than I think, and I'm really struggling to stay afloat. I lose my phone immediately upon impact and I start drifting backwards. Now I didn't realise too, but again the fire had spread even closer and was actually spreading to the wall. The wall was made out of some kind of wood and it wasn't fire resistant whatsoever. I now realise that there's a small clearing where this goes under the wall, but I don't know what's on the other side because I can see smoke coming from here. I decide that I don't have much of an option, and I quickly take my last breath. I close my eyes and I just try and be as peaceful as I can, because if I don't make it, it's not going to make much use panicking now. And within a second, I'm ejected on the other side, and there's no fire. It takes me a while to figure out where I am because I've actually never seen this, but there's some really old rail tracks here. I quickly surface again, and I go to find my phone, but it's long gone. I can't stay for too long because the fire is also spreading on the wall and I can see it at the very top. I eventually beeline it towards where I think civilization should be and thankfully make it to a road in safety. I never recovered my phone and luckily nobody got hurt in the fire, but my god, I still have nightmares about this thing. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat remembering the situation that I was in. During the summer of 2008, it was a rough time to graduate from college. I just spent 4 years getting a degree, only to find that the job market had all but dried up. As bummed out as I was about being unemployed for the foreseeable future, I found a deep appreciation for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up in the Rocky Mountains and graduating from a college in western Montana, I was not a stranger to hiking or camping, but that summer it had become an escape to the point of obsession. Now, going on daily hikes and camping beneath the stars really helps my mental health while I was worried about my life purpose and future. It was June and unseasonably cold and wet. It was even cloudy. The daylight highs barely touched 50 degrees, and at night, it could easily go way below freezing. But despite the weather, I had planned to hike around the Anaconda Range that week, and I wasn't going to let that deter me. My plan for the week, funnily enough, was to hike from Storm Lake, over Storm Lake Pass, and down to Upper Seymour Lake. Storm Lake is a challenge to get to and actually requires a 4x4 pickup and some skilled driving. The road is narrowed and a 2-track winding one, pushing its way through thick pine forests. The way was slick with rain, but I made it to the top with a little heartburn. I set up camp on the north shore of the lake and decided to do some fishing. The fishing was miserable. It was cold and nothing was biting, but the best thing about bad fishing is that my thoughts were free to wander while I sat on the shore. The rain was a constant light drizzle and created a natural white noise. Time passed and my daydreams were cut short as a low rumble comes up from a canoe, overtaking the sounds of rain. The rumbling was not like a distant diesel engine. Now that was a little bit odd. There were no roads that go beyond where I was camped. No machinery or vehicles could be up on the canyon. Maybe it's a plane, I thought, looking up into the rain clouds, but the sound wasn't getting closer or further away, and the sound wasn't actually above me. It came from beyond the lake and up into a canyon. The sound was stationary and constant. This was most certainly not a plane, or a truck or bulldozer. All of this wasn't outright scary, but nonetheless made my hair stand on its ends when I sat there listening. After 20 minutes, the rumbling faded away, and I was again left with only the sounds of rain. Soon enough, I caught a decent sized trout and cleaned it and headed back to camp to get ready for dinner. The fish cooked up fine, but to be honest, I hate trout. It's edible, sure, but totally unappetizing. They taste like mud. I ate as much as I could stand and tossed the rest into the lake. I'm now building up my fire for the night. I sat back to enjoy the evening bit of whiskey. Night comes fast. The mountain ridge put the sun to bed early, and the rain clouds had actually obscured the starlight. It was dark, really dark. There was the sounds of crackling warm fire and rain bouncing off my tent, which were a great comfort and reason for me to lure into sleep. I remind myself that I needed to build up the fire before bed. I walk over to my pile of scavenged firewood and grabbed an armful. Being away from the fire cracking, I could pick up on that all too familiar rumbling sound which rises and falls in the background. It was growing louder and louder, and closer. I may have had a few many pulls of whiskey, but the noise was definitely ringing up to my camp. I yelled out, "Hey, shut up!" Like a switch being flipped. The rumbling sound stopped, and so did the rain, and my heart skips a beat. I realised that isn't actually a coincidence. There was almost an intelligence, something sentient, observing me and responding to my screams, and I wasn't getting the most positive vibes from it. I threw all the logs onto the fire and retreated back to my tent. more on edge than I've ever been before, listening to the fire crackling, to my rapid breathing, and beyond that to the silence of darkness. Before that moment, I had never felt alone and dangerous at the same time. Now I feel vulnerable and alone. Beyond where the firelight faded, I felt that there's actually a million eyes watching me. My paranoia began to subside when suddenly the rain starts again. Not a drizzle, but actually a downpour. I was honestly shocked by this and really glad that I built up the fire, or it would have been snuffed out for sure. My tent was being pushed down by the force of the storm. I thought about bailing to the truck, but I knew I'd be soaked to the bone instantly. Risking injury or death getting over wet is something I can't really risk. I couldn't feel the rain poodling over my tent though, initially, until I focused on it. I now realise that the storm isn't letting up. The urge to get in the pickup and drive away was truly tantalising. I could get my stuff tomorrow in the daylight and spend a few nights in town. But I'd had a bit too much to drink. Driving essentially wasn't going to be a good idea, especially on the muddy 2-track road, which would have actually been a death sentence. But I still needed a safer place to stay than a wimpy tent. Grabbing what I could, I ripped open the tent flaps and ran for the truck. I was soaking wet by the time I settled into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Turning the heat on full blast, I hoped that would dry me out. It was going to be a miserable night. I reclined in my chair, then tried to calm my thoughts with deep breathing. The rain isn't letting up though. I was warm from the heater, and I was riding the crest of a good whiskey buzz, and weirdly the fire was still going strong despite the rain, and keeping my campsite well lit. I remembered the truck's clock reading 1:06 AM. I blinked. It was only a moment, but when I opened my eyes, the rain had stopped. It was foggy and quiet. The once raging campfire was just embers, and there was morning twilight to the east. The truck's clock now read 5:45 AM in the morning. That couldn't be right. Almost 5 hours gone in the blink of an eye. I must have passed out. My head was killing me. Now, I didn't feel like I'd drank that much to justify this feeling. I never had it before. I turned off the truck and stepped out to survey the night's damage. My tent was completely flattened. Tent poles were shattered to pieces. Everything was soaking wet. Smothering in the remains of the fire, I quickly dragged all my junk and pick up and toss things into the bed. My hike over the pass wasn't happening today, that was for sure. It was around 6:30 AM before I finished picking up camp. As I climbed into the cab of my truck, I heard the rumbling again through the morning fog. I drove out as fast as I could down that muddy road, not once looking back. I've never been back to that lake since. In the summer of 2012, I took a job as an expedition canoe guide on the Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota. These are a massive wilderness area of lakes and land. I was working for the Boy Scouts, and we were based on Moose Lake on the US side. My job was to facilitate a fun and safe multi-day trip, anywhere from 7 to 12 days out. Most of the summer was typical, but one expedition in particular still haunts me as a result of what happened to us over the course of a few days. Here is the account in full. My crew was on the younger side. There were 9 of us total. The maximum allowed in a group per a permit. There were 6 scouts, 2 adults, advisors, scoutmasters and myself. They had wanted to do a 200-miler but didn't have the physical ability, so we had to amend our route. They were bummed out, so I decided to take them to a waterfall called Eddy Falls. It's pretty flat up there, so a waterfall is somewhat rare, but that decision would end up putting us in path of something. We visited the falls and camped near to it. That evening, I had the boys working on camp setup while the advisors worked on fire for dinner. I was collecting firewood in a big tangle of down trees, brush and bramble, and I could faintly hear the falls off to my left when out of nowhere I hear the most unearthly scream and roar that I've ever heard. It stops me dead in my tracks. I was frozen. The second scream is closer, and the third is closer still. I couldn't see anything due to the thickness of the brush, but whatever this was, it was actually coming directly towards me now. By the fourth scream, I could actually feel it in my chest. I got nauseous and involuntarily barked at it. I have never before or since heard that sound come out of my body. The fifth scream, though, actually physically hurt. It snapped me back to reality, and I ran back to camp. My crew heard it too, but what do I tell them? I claimed it was the boar. There's no boars up here, and the advisors knew I was lying, but I didn't call my bluff. After dinner, they went to their tents and I retired to my hammock about 50 yards from camp. As a rule, I'd always set up my hammock at my head height, so about 6 feet up. I would use a tarp over my body and head to keep the morning dew off and mosquitoes at bay. But the tarp wasn't strung up. That's important. It was just loosely over me. It must have been around 3 or 4 AM when I was awoken by what sounded to me like a woman sobbing. Not an outright cry, but a sob. At the time, I'm hearing something walking through the thick brush down past my feet, so I listen, totally still, and I'm as quiet as I can be as it crosses into camp. I could hear the change from the brush to granite rock, but could still hear its heavy footsteps as it walks right through the camp and on towards me. At this point, the tarp is still over my head and I couldn't see a thing. I don't know what to do. I had no time as it was standing right next to me. I could hear the breathing, the loud congested sound. I could smell the musk. I could feel its enormous presence only inches from my body. Just standing there, time to make a decision. I suddenly threw my tarp off my head and, as I did, to my left, I touched this thing's chest. Now it was dark, but I could make out briefly a very large upright figure. The hair on it was long and coarse. It was muscular and impressive. Now, it all happened in a second, and as soon as my hand made contact, it actually bolted back into the brush with immense speed for such a thick thing. Now, by the time I got my headlamp and it was gone, my crew had slept through it all until the sun comes up, and I decided, well, I probably shouldn't mention this. The next day, we moved on a few miles towards base camp and camped on a small island. Campsites on the US side are designated by a fire pit and a grumper, which is a fiberglass toilet over a deep hole. We were just arriving and it was evening. One of the adult advisors needed to visit the grumper, so he starts to walk towards it. About 2 minutes later, we hear him yelling, and he come running back to camp, still pulling up his pants, and tells us that he's just seen a gorilla run right in front of him. I asked him if maybe it was a bear, and he said absolutely not, that he'd hunted bears for years, and it was definitely not a bear. It was a monkey, and it was about 9 feet tall. At this heightened estimate, I imagined that this was the thing that I saw by my hammock. If I touched the chest and it was 6 feet off the ground, then that puts its head at about 9 feet up. Was it stalking us? Was there more than one? The boys were now scared. Time to mitigate. I suggest a night paddle. No one's sleeping anymore anyway, so we pack up the things that we have and set out around 8 PM and paddle by a headlamp for several miles. My plan was to get back onto Moose Lake and camp very near to the base so we could be the first crew off the water the following day. Moose Lake is connected to Newfound Lake by a small pitch and a channel of water that's not very deep or wide. There's dark woods on both sides. We were right in the middle of Pinch when a rock the size of a basketball came flying out of the woods on the right side, narrowly missed the bow of the canoe that I was steering. And there's still no cliff there. This thing was forcibly thrown at us from the tree line. At this, we paddled like hell. We paddled to the center of Moose Lake, tied all 3 canoes together, and we sat out there all night. With the sunrise, we paddled to base camp and ended our expedition. Now, they did not want to talk about what happened, and I was okay with that. They left for Oklahoma the next day. After they left, I went to work a shift in the canoe yard, helping crews offload. My buddy Justin got back for that day from a trip in the same area that we had been to in Bear Loop, and as I was helping him put a boat on the rack, I noticed he had a distant stare, almost like a 1,000-yard stare. I thought this was odd, and I say to him, "Well, how did your trip go?" And he said it was all good until they hit Knife Lake / Newfoundland Lake. He said that they thought they were being messed around with for 2 nights on Knife and actually had a rock thrown at them. Sure enough, for a solid 2 weeks after that crew kept coming back from that area with solid stories matching this one. One night, there was a crowd of guides in the staff lodge swapping trail stories, and these encounters came up one after another. You know, the screams, rocks, sightings of apes. Then from the back corner of the room I hear a chuckle. It's one of the old veteran guides who had been there for over a decade. All he said was, "It's about time that somebody else seen one." I asked how long he'd known they were there. He said that he'd actually been encountering them for 10 years, and he said they talked to me. This shocked me, and I said, "Like a language?" He said no, telepathically. The less you acknowledge them, the less they'll bother you, but they can read you like a book. Now, what happened out there is still a big question in my mind. I've always been open to the idea of Sasquatches. Their existence was never a huge stretch for me. But what really sticks with me is the way that the veteran guide spoke of their intelligence and parapsychological abilities. That they can read human emotion as clear as pages in a book, that they know our specialties and our abilities even greater than our own species ourselves. I work as a park ranger, and I had something that I experienced today which I don't quite understand. One of my other worker colleagues had told me that he'd seen something weird that he couldn't explain and wanted me to investigate too. He'd given me the exact location and said that he wasn't going to preface it, he just wanted me to go there and let him know what my experience was, and I said okay. I was actually a little bit cautious, but I'd known this colleague for a while, so I make my way over to that location and I find a door, literally in the middle of the woods, for no reason at all. It looks like quite an old door, but kind of like a grand one that you might see on an old house, and weirdly, it had one of those old door knockers. I look around and don't see anything and decide to get closer and make it up to the door. Now when I get to the door, I can hear a weird sound around it, almost like lots and lots of people whispering, but there's no one around. It's very faint but very distinct. I decide that I should maybe try and open it, but before I do, I'm kind of caught making eye contact with the knocker. It's so creepy looking. It's like an almost demon face one, but I decide to tap on it a few times to knock on the door. And as I do so, for a moment, everything changes to red and black in colour, almost like I'm looking at something through a filter. I look around and I can only describe this as being in hell. I'm in what appears to be a weird cave system or something. I can hear screams all around me, some weird dark figures moving in the distance, and there seems to be blood dripping off everything. And within a second I go back to normal, and the whispering stopped. So I very bravely sprint back and get all the way back to the station and report to my buddy what had happened. He said he didn't know what to make of it too. Now this is the weirdest part. When we went back to investigate with a group of others and were actually recording it this time, it's nowhere to be found. We gone to the exact spot that we had both seen it, and it was literally completely gone, like it never existed in the first place. I found 4 crude gravestones as a child that dated back to the 1860s deep in the woods. Now they're gone and no one seems to remember. I don't have much of a story, and the title pretty much summarizes it, but I go to this area often as an adult, but nothing's ever there like before. I remembered when I found them and showed them to my stepmom and dad. I know I did, but 25 years later they act like they have no clue what I'm talking about, as if it was all a dream. The footers of the headstones would have suggested young children. I'm not even sure if this is correct, but I'm just looking for closure. I know what I saw it multiple times. I used to spend half the day hiking there, and I'd just sit there with them as a kid. I'd like to mark those kids' graves because I feel like they deserve not to be forgotten, but no one seems to remember. About a year ago, I moved my family and I to go a home way out in the woods in Tennessee. I wanted to be brief here, but I need to get this off my chest, and after looking into this matter a little more, I have a lot more detail that I think will paint a clear picture in the end, so please bear with me. The nights here can be extremely loud. Between the crickets, the frogs, and the other things, it can be almost deafening. One night, not too long after we moved in, I had forgotten something in my car and headed out to get it. The first thing that struck me as odd was that my dog wouldn't go outside with me. My dog goes everywhere with me, as I am her whole world, but not this night. As I held the door open, she looked out and looked up and kind of noped. So I walk out and shut the door behind me. The second thing that caught me off guard was that there was not a peep. It's dead silent. I still remembered shrugging this off and walking down my front steps and heading towards my car. When I'd gotten about 10 feet from the car, all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt as though something was watching me. I looked around and see nothing. After I reached in my car for what I'd forgotten to grab earlier, I had this feeling like something was moving towards me. I took a step back and checked around me. All of a sudden, I heard one of the hedges next to me that lined the walkway to our front door rattle. At first I thought it was a rabbit that I had spooked, as I'd seen one just earlier in the day. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of a large rock landing a few feet away from me. I hit the walk and bounced into the shrub. I drew my gun and called out and said, "Whoever it is, you're about to be shot." After a few seconds of nothing, I began to feel like maybe this was some local teenager messing with the new people. I holstered my sidearm, turned around and started walking towards my front door. Almost as soon as I turned towards my house, I heard this deep panting sound. It sounded like a huge dog, but what made me note back to my front door was that it sounded like it's right behind me. I leaped up onto my porch, turned around and drew my gun again, expecting something right there, but there's nothing. A couple of weeks later, I was on my porch at night sitting on a bench with my wife. She just got up and walked in to get something, and as soon as she shut the door, I heard the panting sound again. I couldn't see anything, yet this sounded like it was right on top of me. The sound was coming from everywhere and it was loud. Again, I couldn't see anything, so I noped back into my home. Now at this point I was questioning moving here, but after nothing else really happened, I decided to let it go. A month or so later, it was a really rainy and stormy night. This is around 9 PM, and my wife and I enjoy listening to the rain and talking about how relaxing it is. Now, me growing up in Oregon, I love the rain. And for the past 10 years, we lived in Vegas, where it would dump the entire year's worth of rain, but suddenly be bone dry for the rest of it. For my wife, who grew up in Nevada, it was such a rare thing, and she loved going outside to watch it. So for us, this is actually an enjoyable thing. Except this particular night when things took a weird turn. As we're sitting there talking about how relaxing the rain sounds, my wife stopped me and said, "Do you hear that?" "No. What did you hear?" I swear it sounded like a small child calling out for help, right in the woods. No, I didn't hear anything. And after a few moments of us listening, we hear it again, or at least she does. I say, "I don't hear a thing. Are you sure you're not just hearing things?" And she looks at me offended, saying, "No, I'm positive. It was our son. I think he's out there and lost." I say, No, he's sleeping on the couch." We then both look through the blinds that were right open behind us, and we can see all of our children laying there. She said, "That's so weird. I swear it sounded like our son." I said, "Well, it isn't him. He's right there. And besides, I don't hear anything." She then stands up and says, "Wow, he's really crying out for help. I need to look now." At this point, if you knew my wife, you would know she is absolutely creeped out by the woods and wouldn't be caught dead walking into them during daylight, much less at night during a storm. I grabbed her hand and said, "I have been listening intently and there is absolutely no one calling out for help. You stay here." At this point, I'm getting worried about her. She was acting completely out of character, not to mention that she was 8 months pregnant with our baby daughter. She then says, "What if there is a child out there in the woods?" I said, "Well, first off, I would be able to hear it too. Secondly, there's no other kids around here for miles and miles, and what's the odds of them being lost out there?" She said, "I know, but what if it's a kid?" Before I could say anything, she stands up and starts walking towards the stairs. I jumped up and grabbed her again, saying, "You're not getting out there. I don't know what's going on, but you need to stay inside," and it thoroughly freaks me out. A few moments after this, just as it's getting dark outside, I heard the front door open and I get up to investigate. Now we have 2 twins who are 6 years old, and we have the door set up so they can't open it without us there. So to hear this sound, it could only be my wife. That was weird, and the fact that she doesn't usually go outside without telling me. I walked out the front and saw my wife walking down our private road towards the drive on the side of our home. I asked her what she's doing. She said that no, I was just sitting on the back patio and kept hearing a baby crying in the woods. I said, "Seriously, and you just decide to walk off to investigate?" She then looks into the woods and says, "See, there it is again." And again, I can't hear anything, but what I did notice is that it was completely silent out again. I told her, just like before, the chances of a baby being out there in the woods outside of our home is slim, and that she needed to get back in the house. She said, "What if somebody's baby's there?" I said, "Well, if that were true, I would hear it too." Now at this point, I was getting really worried about my wife's mental health. I actually asked her to see a psychiatrist, but she did. Now looking back, I felt really bad about this, but I had to do it. Now a few days after this, we went out on the porch. It's early evening and I just mowed the lawn this day, and our 3-year-old son was riding around on his little car in front of the house. Now he knows that he's not to go outside of a certain area that we mapped out. He loves playing outside, But with the road behind 50 feet or so from the porch, we have to be careful. So we're always cautious, and as we're talking, we both keep an eye on him. A neighbour drives by and stops to say hello. The interaction literally took 8 seconds, as of them basically asking how we are and stuff. He then says he's going to stop by later as his wife got something for the kids. And we said okay, great, and he drives off. I now look over to where that our son should be, and he's nowhere to be seen. I called out his name again and can hear his car on our side drive. I scold him for leaving the area, and he said something in his 3-year-old gibberish and pointed to the woods behind our home. I said he had 5 seconds to get back up to the front or else, and he adamantly pointed in the direction of the woods again, kept trying to tell me something. I look off in the direction of the woods and just assumed that he saw a squirrel or deer or something and wanted to see it up close. I walk him back up to the front of the house, and he actually cried the whole way there. He got really upset that I wouldn't let him go into the woods, but I just wrote this off as him being curious and like most 3-year-old boys are. Now, this incident wasn't an isolated one, and both of our twins have weirdly done something similar, but not quite as extreme as this. There have actually been nights where we've just laid down and hear a loud bang on the side of our house on the wall behind our bed. It was so loud that I jumped up and looked out the window. Our floodlight had come on, but I couldn't see anything. Now, the weird part about this is that our bedroom sits about 12 feet from the ground level, as we have a full-size basement that's cinder block. Now, I put on my slippers and grabbed one of my 12-gauge shotguns and walked out to investigate. It was dead silent again. The floodlights are on again on the side of the house, and I think this is pretty weird, but I get there and there's nothing. I then walk back around the house and shine the light around intently. As I approached the back side of the house, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like someone was watching me. I shine the lights up the tree and don't see anything. I round the corner, and the first thing I notice is that my 3 dogs that are in my area aren't making a sound. Now, our dogs have no filter and bark at everyone and everything, including me. So to see them all hiding with their tails between their legs had me horrified, really. As I kept walking, all of a sudden, the crickets and frogs start making sounds again. It was as if that somebody flicked a switch. I walked back into the house and told my wife that I hadn't seen anything. She shrugged and said, okay, as long as our dogs are okay. Due to the circumstances that night, I decided to let the dogs sleep in and with us. This very thing happened on all 4 exterior walls, not just one. It's random but annoying, but terrifying nonetheless. There's also been a few times when we're sitting in the house as I was watching a movie, and my wife walked over to me and said, "Did you call me?" I said no, and she said that she could have sworn that she heard my name, and I said no, I didn't say anything. She said it was definitely my voice, but she doesn't understand because it sounded so close, but I was 20 feet away in a recliner. The important part to this is that she was sitting at the table doing something, and the slider to the backyard was open behind her. Now, our patio sits about 20 feet off the ground and is like a balcony as it has no stairs to access it. I think the previous owner built it for barbecuing. There have been several instances where she would say she heard somebody whispering in my ear, but she couldn't make out the sound. Again, I kept thinking she was crazy, but as you'll see, this is all tied to one final moment. The last thing I want to mention before we get into what happened is that I have a shooting range built behind my workshop on the opposite side of the property next to the main road. It's kind of on a downslope, but it works perfectly for what I needed. The range itself is cut straight into the woods, going down about 100 yards or so. When you're at the range, you have the woods surrounding you on all sides except for getting back to my shop. I have to say it always felt creepy when I am dealing with my targets or mowing. When you are down there, it feels like you're miles from anyone. Now one day around 5 in the evening, I was sighting a new scope on my rifle. The sun was still up, but was going to fade soon. So I knew this was going to be the final test. Now up until this point, there was nothing really happening while I made my multiple trips down range, other than feeling weird. As I get down range, I kept getting the feeling that somebody's watching me and I can't shake it. I look around and don't see a thing. As I was placing stickers over my previous shots, I heard something big off the side behind me. It sounded like a large branch snapping off a tree. Now if you've been in Tennessee before in the woods, you know that this happens a lot, especially in the middle of nowhere. So this is nothing new, except for this time it was very loud and it sounded like fresh strong wood, if that makes sense. I turned around again but can't see anything. I start walking back up to my rifle and I swear I heard somebody right behind me. I turned around again but saw nothing. As I start to walk again, I hear this deep growl. It really sounds deep and loud, and what's worse is that it's actually all around me. I turned around facing the range and start walking backwards. The thought of some rabid dog charging me is really terrifying, but I know running's not a good idea if this is the case. So I walked slowly backwards up the hill with my rifle, but nothing happened. I grabbed my rifle and sprayed the target with rapid fire, hoping to scare off whatever this thing is. I left 10 rounds in the mag and grabbed my rifle bag quickly, going back up to the house. Now fast forward to roughly a year later, when we moved in and my niece is staying with us as a live-in nanny to earn money. We're on our way back from the store about a mile from our house, and I saw 2 eyes reflecting in the headlights coming from a wide tree on the side of the road just ahead. It took all my attention because they were higher than a deer but a different size and colour. Just as I said, "What's that?" they squint and vanish. I had made a comment that it was almost as though it had known that I could see its size and suddenly moved. The colour was kind of golden green, but they resembled the mannerisms of a large cat and felt ominous. It's really hard for me to explain, but I really can't define exactly what I saw. It's truly like nothing else. Now a few moments later, when we arrive at the house, as we were getting bags out of the car, my 3-year-old son come bolting out of the house excited to see me. As I was waiting to help her carry in the bags, I heard my dog growl. I look in the direction she was looking and it's at my neighbour's property across the street. Now what I saw has kept me up all night. Up till this point, I've always been skeptical that anything was out there, as I've never seen anything with my own 2 eyes. Now, my street is on a kind of spread out neighbourhood. Each house actually sits on several acres, and at the end of our road is Kentucky Lake. Our neighbour's house sits adjacent to the house on an acre lot. Directly in front of my house is a wall of woods, and directly behind my house is several thousand acres which are untouched. As I was looking across the street to my neighbour's property, I see a large dark figure between the trees at first. The movement caught me off guard, as it looked like something big moving quickly. Then it came into clear view and stood up. At first, it looks like a man, almost walking like one, and I don't know what to make of it. It was very tall, but what was strange is that the distance it covered was really not possible to be made by a human. It was clearly walking quickly, but moving faster than anyone can sprint. More importantly, there's no sound. It was like it was phasing in and out of reality when it moved. I shout out, "What is that?" and realise that it's looking directly at us. It's moved at such a crazy angle that it's minimising its body now to not be seen so well, suddenly going silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realised that whatever it is stalking us. I tell my niece to go in the house now, and I grab my AR-15 with a short scope and came back outside to see my niece still grabbing stuff out the car. Knowing her, I tell her very firmly that you have to get back in the house. Her disregard to my command annoyed me, but I still watch over her without saying a word as she was slowly walking. She turned around towards the woods and across the street from my house, and then suddenly bolted for the house. She ran up the stairs in a panicked state, and she said, "I heard something big in the woods walking loudly on the leaves. When I turned around, I heard a deep growl." I asked her why she didn't come when I told her, and she said that she thought I was talking to the sun. I told her about what I'd seen, and she wanted to get a closer look to see if she could see anything. I told her it's not a good idea, but she goes anyway. She begins walking down the walkway, and I heard the sound of dry leaves crunching in the woods across the street. I told her to stop and come and take the flashlight. Now at this point she's about 3 feet away from my wife's SUV. As she turned and started walking back to me, I caught the glimpse of something grey and hairy bolt from the SUV back across the street into the woods. My porch is a raised porch, and our SUV is about 6.5 feet tall, and whatever this thing is cleared about 45 feet in what appears to be a single jump. It moves honestly like lightning. Whatever it was, it wanted my niece. It jumped in front of the car and caught my line of sight and was waiting for her. Now for whatever reason, she still doubted my warnings and grabs a flashlight and walks back towards the car. As she entered my driveway, she stops dead in her tracks, leaning forward as if she could see something. I asked her what she saw, and she turned and ran back on the porch terrified, saying no, no, no. She said it was a figure hiding inside of a tree, and she saw its eyes. I asked her what do they look like, and she said dull red at first, but as she gets closer it appears almost dead. She said it kind of looked really dark grey and was hard to describe, but the pupils were looking like something that's blind. She wanted to go out again and took a step down the stairs, and as she did, it revealed itself from the tree again. I said, "Get inside now." I went in and locked the door and look and see a tall human-shaped being, looking really tall and ominous as anything. The next morning, we actually do a height comparison to the tree limb she saw it, and it must have been about 9 feet, and apparently a size are about 6 feet apart. At this point I don't know what that thing is, and after doing some research I think it was maybe a crawler or glimmerman. I looked to see if there had been any other sightings in my area, but none. More importantly, I swear it would phase in and out of almost like a shadow person or being. Now, I don't know what to make of this, and I don't know if this thing could communicate telepathically somehow, because it would explain how I always had a weird feeling and could hear things, or my wife would at least. Secondly, it has like a playback communication, so when I heard a dog panting, it was probably one of the dogs that this had heard and then replicated somehow, and the same again with some of my children. Now, it really scares me. I hate the fact that I've seen something like this. Now, the more I read about this thing, the more everything that's been happening over the past year makes sense. One thing I find extra convincing is that down the road towards the lake, there's a property that is barbed wired off and is a wall of forest with no driveway. A lot of the properties on our road is undeveloped owned land, and no one on these actually goes to live there, but there's a sign that says Screamer lives here, with an arrow pointing into the woods. Now I have to admit that when I first saw the sign I actually laughed, thinking it was maybe the owner screamed at trespassers, but now I'm not so sure. I have some stories to share. They're all true, but I don't know, I'll start with the weirdest one first. When I was like 5, my parents had bought a house with a large yard, about an acre back, and there's a forest. One day, my granny was babysitting me. I decided to run around the backyard and play. She went inside to go to the bathroom. I remembered something beckoning me to go into the forest. Just a strong urge. so I do. I didn't go in very far before coming across a perfectly circular area filled with flowers. The sun was shining on it through the trees. It was so bright, and they're all different colours. There was a buck standing in the middle of it staring at me. I was a little confused and it looks huge to me. I got a bit closer and it didn't run. It just watches me. I got so excited about the beautiful scene that I actually ran back to tell my granny. When I did, she was looking at me horrified, saying, "Where did you go?" I was looking everywhere and got worried sick. Apparently I'd been gone for a long time. I was confused. Now, regardless, I insisted on showing her what I found. She followed me into the woods and we went past where all the wildflowers were and some of the deers are. Now, we were exactly where I was, but it was gone. I swore up and down to tell her about what I found, but it just wasn't there now. I remembered being really upset and confused. To this day, I wonder if I walked into some kinds of portal or dimension. When I turned 13, we lived elsewhere, but I started having dreams about a single door in the middle of the woods. It was reoccurring for a number of years and really makes you wonder what's actually out there. I remembered there was a light snowfall the previous day on this particular patrol. There was nothing I had to worry about really. Every so often I'd have to come to the rescue of people that got lost. Usually it was just tourists that would come to our country and want to be out in the snow and forest and not really be prepared for it. They'd often be very cold and not well equipped for the weather. It could be especially easy to get some kind of frostbite out here. Now, it's always cold all year round, but it can be especially nasty in winter. So that was what I was expecting most of my day to be like. Now, I remembered I had the occasional urge to look over my shoulder, but I fought against it. The scenery was okay. It wasn't so great today. A lot of the snow had went a bit slushy. Water was frozen and the paths were a bit muddy too. Every so often I would see some hikers and I'd say hello to them. Often they'd get confused about where they needed to go, and it was my job to redirect them into the right areas of the wilderness where they were allowed to go. Now, eventually I have to get a bit further away from people because I need to go to the outskirts of where my ranger station patrols. This is where we'd get the most weird activity. Every so often we'd hear things in the night here that we couldn't pin down to a particular animal. All of the animals that we get here should be pretty scared of us, but I don't know. It seemed like you could almost guarantee that when you went here around 12 at night, you would hear a strange animal call that sounded very big. It sounded like a very large creature had to make it, so yeah, I was always cautious while being here. I eventually come up to the very perimeter of where I need to patrol and go through the gate. I'm now away from the people and the atmosphere is a lot different. Because of this being in close proximity to water, there was almost a mist covering everything. I think it's called sea drift, but I don't actually know the correct term for it. But I start making my way through the trees and I'm just having my general search. I have another buddy that's working with me and he's covering the area that I've come from, so I feel pretty safe to be out here and freely roam around. All of the trees here don't have any leaves on them, so it means that if you're not careful, one of the branches will get you in the face or neck, so I'm constantly cautious of this. I eventually make it through to a clearing and all is as it should be. I have the body of water to my right, and I'm just conscious to make sure I don't get too close to it, because sometimes it can be deceiving how close you are to danger. Now, I do notice something's odd. The gate that I've just come from is now open, which is pretty bizarre. I look around and I'm convinced that I closed it. In fact, I even remembered the sound of it closing. But when I've looked back, it's 100% open, and I know for a fact that I haven't done it. So I think this is odd. I quickly just have a look round to make sure that nobody's actually followed me in, but there's no one whatsoever. But I try my best not to let it bother me and just think, well, it was probably just in my head and I guess the gate flung itself open again. I ended up going a little bit deeper in now. Now I'm getting further and further away from the water, so it's getting a bit less and less misty, and this makes me feel more confident. I'm now into an area that's basically only used by us. It's where we have like a large cabin shed thing. I don't know what you guys call it again, maybe what you guys refer to as a barn, but it's basically where that we keep all of our equipment that we're not using. We had some pretty cool things here too. We actually had like a little ATV and off-road thing that we would use sometimes to rescue people, or just as like a rapid response thing. But we've got no need to use it this particular day, so I just continue up ahead like normal. Now eventually I get to the very end of where I need to patrol, and that's when I hear it. The sound. Ah yes, the sound that we've grown so accustomed to, and one that I'm not actually scared of now. I call back and say, hey, are you going to show yourself today or what? I don't say it in English but my own language, but the sound stops immediately, and I kind of laugh to myself thinking, well, today I'm going to dance with this thing. Now I continue on as I do the last part of my rounds until I notice something's up ahead of me. I can see quite a tall creature standing roughly where the shoreline is of the body of water. It looks almost like a snowman, but more similar to a tree in terms of its exterior. This thing doesn't move an inch, and I start walking towards it, confident that this is just a person that's hunting and shouldn't be here. I call out, hey, you're not supposed to be hunting here. I actually managed to jog all the way up to this thing without it moving an inch. Until then, it just takes off and heads straight towards the water. I suddenly realise that this isn't actually a hunter, and this is something different. I realise because when it's wading through into the icy waters, it isn't shuddering at all, and it literally just disappears down into the lake. Now, while doing so, I realise that there's a really bad smell around, and I can still see this thing moving underwater, and I now get the scale of it because I've come much closer. It was probably about 6.5 or 7 feet tall, absolutely massive. It's actually swimming more like a fish now that it's underwater, until it stops and stares at me, and its eyes are almost glowing a yellowy orange colour. I was extremely brave and decide to sprint out of there and get all the way back to the station. I radio in what I saw, and some of the guys go out to try and investigate. They say they can't see anyone, just the tracks of somebody or something coming out of the water, getting to the exact spot that I saw this thing at, and then disappearing. But the worst part about it is, all of them think that I made up the story and that I was lying to them, trying to pull a quick one on them. But I know what I saw that day. I haven't seen it since, but it's still really weird. I was travelling solo around the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State and making various stops in the Olympic National Park. I decided to stop in Quintenot for the first time and took a random road that dead-ended at a beautiful spot at the edge of the river. There was an ancient footbridge that led across the river, but it looked as though it might collapse if you try and cross it, so I decided against it. It was off-season, and I was not in a tourist area. I was the only one there. It was so unusually hot outside that I decided I needed to get into the water. I backed my car all the way to the edge of the dead-end road, faced it out in the direction that I would need to leave. I then start hiking through the thick brush, down an embankment into the edge of the water. It was mid-fall, and I didn't have a suit since I didn't plan on swimming, so I took my clothes off and got in there. I had a nice swim, but I could not shake the feeling that I'm being watched, even though I'm in the middle of nowhere. After about 5 minutes, the creepy feeling was enough for me to head back, so I started to climb out, turned my back to the other side of the river and walked back to where my clothes and shoes are. When I turned around, there was a big tall man standing in plain sight just across from me on the other side of the river, but higher up on the embankment, and I didn't notice him at first. He's wearing a poncho made of animal pelts, had long hair full of sticks and twigs, and looked as though he'd been living out in the wild for a long time. We stood and stared at each other, well, me froze in terror really, for what felt like forever, when all of a sudden he frantically took off on foot to the bridge leading across the water. I grabbed my car keys, tried to grab my clothes and shoes, but they got tangled up in some blackberry vines, so I left everything. I went running for my life through the thick brush, blackberries, barefoot, and in my underwear, trying to make it to my car before he made it across the river. There was no doubt in my mind that he's gonna hurt me. When I made it out of the blackberries, I could see that he was crossing the bridge towards me more rapidly. I get to my car, flung the door open just as he arrived. I locked the doors while he pounded on the hood of my car, just screaming and grunting non-verbally. The moment he went for my driver's side door, I hit the gas and took off as quick as I can. I looked back and he was chasing after me. He must have ran after my car for at least a mile until he faded from view. I was bleeding everywhere from running through the blackberries. I was unclothed, shaken and crying. Had I have hesitated for 10 seconds longer, I don't think I would have got out of there alive. Even typing out this story all these years later is actually making me shake. I will never ever go back to that area, and since that moment I always bring a hiking buddy with me to be safe. Now I was in Yellowstone riding a bicycle fast down a great curve. Cars are stopped. I look up ahead and there's a grizzly. I could have easily hit into the cars or the grizzly bear itself. I'm just glad that I made it out of there okay. Now once I was driving into Yosemite at 4 AM and saw something in the road as I come around a corner. I slammed on my brakes and it turned out to be a wolf. Several years later, I mentioned this to someone offhand and they said Yosemite didn't have any wolves. I looked it up and they have exactly one wolf in the park. I realised that I nearly prowled into this one single wolf and I'm very glad that I managed not to. Once while in a national park, I was chilling in a hammock and my family started yelling at me to run away. Turns out, there was a bear right near me. I slowly walk away and the bear actually went inside my hammock to start eating different things there.